Beneath the surface. Prologue, the hollow earth paradox. The ground beneath your feet feels solid. It is the very definition of stability. Terra firma. We build our skyscrapers upon it, pave our roads over it, and bury our dead within it. We assume that the map of the world is a two-dimensional sheet, stretching north, south, east, and west. But we are wrong. The map of human history has a third dimension, depth. For as long as humans have looked up at the stars with wonder, they have also looked down at the earth with a primal mix of fear and necessity. The surface is exposed. The surface is where the wind howls, where the predators hunt, where the enemy armies march, and where the radiation burns. To survive, humanity has often had to claw its way downward, reversing the birth process to return to the womb of the planet. This story is not about geology. It is not about tectonic plates or magma chambers. It is about the phantom cities that mirror our own. Imagine standing in a kitchen in modern-day Turkey. You are renovating your home. You swing a sledgehammer at a basement wall, expecting to find soil or bedrock. Instead, the wall crumbles away into a dark void. You shine a flashlight into the breach and realize you haven't just found a hole, you have found a hallway. That hallway leads to a room, which leads to a staircase, which descends 18 stories deep, capable of housing 20,000 people, their livestock, and their dreams. This actually happened. This is Derinkuyu. Imagine walking through the romantic streets of Paris, the city of light, unaware that directly beneath your café table lie the neatly stacked femurs and skulls of 6 million Parisians, a silent necropolis 3 times the population of the living city above. This book is a descent. We will rappel into the darkness to find that it is not empty. It is teeming with stories of ingenuity, terror, faith, and the indomitable human will to survive. From the soft volcanic rock of Cappadocia to the radioactive-proof bunkers of the Cold War, we will uncover the architecture of the dark. Take a deep breath. The air is about to get stale, cool, and quiet. We are going down. The ancient refuge. The soft stone of Cappadocia. Aye, the accidental discovery. The year was 1963. The location was the Nevşehir province in central Anatolia, Turkey. The landscape here looks like it belongs to another planet. It is a world of fairy chimneys, tall, cone-shaped rock formations that jut out of the earth like silent sentinels, sculpted by millions of years of wind and rain eroding the soft volcanic tuff. For centuries, locals had used the natural caves in these rocks for storage or cool living quarters. But no one realized the scale of what lay beneath the town of Derinkuyu until a local man, whose name has been lost to the footnotes of history but whose sledgehammer blow echoes through archaeology, decided to renovate his house. He knocked down a wall in his basement. Behind it, he found a room he didn't know existed. Curious, he explored further and found a narrow passageway leading deeper. He followed it. The air grew cooler. The sounds of the surface world, the chickens, the cars, the wind, faded into a heavy silence. He had stumbled upon the door to the underworld. What archaeologists uncovered in the following years shattered their understanding of ancient engineering. This wasn't just a cellar. It was an impossible metropolis. Derinkuyu was not a cave. It was a carved city. It plunged approximately 85 meters, 279 feet, into the earth. 2. The geology of survival. To understand how Derinkuyu exists, one must first understand the stone. Millions of years ago, volcanoes in the region, Mount Erciyes and Mount Hasan, erupted violently, blanketing the plateau in ash and lava. Over eons, this ash solidified into a soft, porous rock called tuff. Tuff is unique. When it is exposed to the air, it hardens. But when it is buried, it is soft enough to be carved with simple hand tools. It is nature's perfect building block for a civilization that needs to disappear. The Phrygians, an Indo-European people of antiquity, are believed to have started the digging around the 8th century BC, though some argue the Hittites began it even earlier. But why dig? Why trade the sun for the shadow? The answer, as it so often is in human history, was fear. Anatolia was a bridge between east and west, a highway for conquering armies. The Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Mongols, the Arabs, they all marched through these plains. If you lived on the surface, you were grass to be trampled. If you lived beneath it, you were a ghost. 3. The architecture of the dark. As we descend past the first level, intended for livestock, to keep the smell away from the living quarters below and to make it easier to herd animals in and out, the sophistication becomes apparent. This was not a hole to hide in for a few hours. This was a city designed for months, perhaps years, of confinement. The city contains kitchens, blackened by centuries of soot. It has stables with mangers carved directly into the rock. There are wineries, complete with vats for stomping grapes, because even in the dark, humanity requires wine. There are chapels for worship, proving that faith did not require the sky. There are even schoolrooms. In one barrel-vaulted room, there are small depressions carved into the floor, believed to be study desks for students. But the most terrifying and ingenious features are the defenses. Derinquia was a fortress. Connecting the levels are narrow corridors, intentionally built low so that an invader would have to crouch, moving slowly and awkwardly. At strategic points in these corridors, there are massive circular stone doors. These millstones weigh up to half a ton. They could only be rolled shut from the inside. Once closed, they sealed the tunnel completely. In the center of the stone door was a small hole. This allowed the defenders to spear the invaders who were stuck on the other side, or to watch them panic as they realized they were trapped in the dark. 4. The psychology of the deep. Living here required a unique psychology. Imagine the sensory deprivation. No sunlight. No horizon. The passage of time would be marked not by the rising sun, but by the rhythm of the oil lamps. Sanitation was handled through deep pits, but the smell of thousands of people and animals must have been intense, mitigated only by the greatest engineering feat of the city, the ventilation shafts. These massive shafts, some reaching 55 meters deep, pierced through all the levels like a spine. They brought fresh air from the surface down to the deepest caverns. They also served as wells, tapping into the water table below. Crucially, the wells were accessible from the bottom up, but often cut off from the surface to prevent enemies from poisoning the water supply. As the locals huddled in the flickering light, listening to the muffled thud of horses' hooves of the Roman or Arab armies searching for them above, they survived. They turned the earth into a shield. Derinquia is the opening chapter of our journey because it sets the stakes. It proves that the underground is not just a place of death or burial. It is a place of life. It is where humanity goes when the surface becomes a hell. But as we will see in the next chapter, not all underground worlds were built for survival. Some were built to hide things much darker than refugees. The ventilation shafts. The invisible enemy. In the hierarchy of survival, there is a brutal rule of threes. A human can survive 3 weeks without food. They can survive 3 days without water. But they can survive only 3 minutes without air. When we think of the dangers facing the inhabitants of Derinquia, the 20,000 refugees hiding from the Arab-Byzantine wars or the Roman legions, we imagine the sword and the spear. We imagine the terrifying sound of soldiers marching overhead. But the true enemy of the underground city was not a soldier. It was chemistry. Imagine the biological load of 20,000 humans crowded into a confined space. Add to that thousands of livestock, sheep, goats, chickens, stabled on the upper levels. Add to that the thousands of oil lamps burning animal fat or linseed oil to push back the darkness. Add to that the hundreds of tandoor ovens baking bread. Every breath exhaled is carbon dioxide. Every flame consumes oxygen and releases smoke. In a sealed cavern, this is a recipe for a dead air pocket. The carbon dioxide, being heavier than oxygen, would sink to the lower levels, silently suffocating the inhabitants in their sleep. The smoke would rise, choking those near the ceiling. Without a sophisticated solution, Derinquia would not have been a refuge. It would have been a mass grave within 48 hours. The fact that it wasn't is a testament to an engineering marvel that rivals the aqueducts of Rome or the pyramids of Giza, the ventilation shaft. The vertical miracle. If you stand on the surface of the dusty plateau in Cappadocia today, you might miss them. They look like simple wells, innocuous holes in the ground. But if you drop a stone down one, you will wait a long time to hear it hit the water. The builders of Derinquia sank over 50 massive ventilation shafts throughout the city. The primary shaft is a masterpiece of vertical excavation. It plunges 55 meters, 180 feet, straight down, roughly the height of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, but carved in reverse, into the bedrock. The precision required to dig this is baffling. Without modern laser levels or surveying equipment, the ancient engineers maintained a near-perfect vertical alignment. They likely used simple plumb lines, weights attached to strings, to ensure gravity guided their chisels true. These shafts served as the city's lungs. But they did not work by powered fans or machinery. They worked by physics. The engineers understood the principles of thermodynamics. The air inside the caves maintains a constant temperature of about 13 degrees Celsius 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Outside, the Anatolian plains swing from scorching summers to freezing winters. This temperature differential creates a natural chimney effect. When the air outside is hotter than the rock summer, the cool, heavy air inside the shaft sinks, pushing the stale, warmer air up and out through smaller exhaust fissures. When the air outside is colder, winter, the warm air inside rises, drawing fresh, cold air down into the depths. The city breathed. It inhaled and exhaled in rhythm with the seasons, a respiratory system made of stone. The smoke paradox. The problem of air was solved, but the problem of smoke remained. How do you cook dinner for a city without giving away your position? A pillar of smoke rising from the ground would be a beacon to any enemy army passing miles away. "Here we are!" it would scream. "Come and kill us!" The solution was dispersion. Archaeologists have found communal kitchens on the upper levels of the city. These kitchens were equipped with tandoor-style ovens carved into the floor. But unlike a normal chimney that goes straight up, the flues in Derinquia were often dug at oblique angles or connected to the main ventilation shafts far below the surface exit. By the time the smoke traveled through these winding channels and mixed with the massive volume of fresh air in the main shafts, it had cooled and dissipated. When it finally exited the ground, it wasn't a thick black plume, it was a thin, invisible haze, easily scattered by the Cappadocian wind. They were cooking right under the enemy's nose, and the enemy never smelled a thing. The water of life and death. The ventilation shafts had a dual purpose. They were not just air ducts, they were wells. The water table in Cappadocia lies deep. The main shaft was dug deep enough to pierce the aquifer, providing an unlimited supply of fresh, cold water. This was the lifeline. A siege is only effective if you can starve or dehydrate the defenders. With a well inside the walls, the inhabitants of Derinquia could outweight any army. However, the engineers knew that a well is also a vulnerability. If the enemy finds the wellhead on the surface, they can poison it. They can throw down carcasses or toxins, destroying the city without ever drawing a sword. To counter this, the builders employed a brilliant strategic disconnect. Not all shafts reached the surface. Some wells were blind. They rose from the water table up to the first or second level of the underground city and then stopped, capped by solid rock meters below the ground. These wells were completely invisible from the surface. Even if an enemy army found and poisoned the main visible ventilation shafts, the internal, blind, wells would remain pure, accessible only to those already inside. The whispering walls. There is a final, haunting function of these shafts that visitors to Derinquia notice today. The acoustics. Because the shafts cut through every level of the city, from the stables at the top to the temporary graves and meeting halls at the bottom, they acted as a primitive telephone system. If a sentry on the top level saw the dust of an approaching army, they could shout down the shaft. The sound would carry, echoing off the smooth stone walls, reaching the deepest floors in seconds. "The enemy is here! Roll the stones!" Orders could be relayed instantly. Families separated on different levels could communicate. The shaft was the central nervous system, connecting the extremities of the city to its brain. It creates a chilling image: thousands of people, sitting in the semi-darkness of the 8th level, 280 feet underground, listening to the echoes drifting down from the world above. They would hear the screams of battle, the thud of the battering rams against the upper doors, and the silence that followed. They would wait by the shaft, listening for the password that meant it was safe to come up, or the silence that meant they were the last humans left alive. Beyond Derinkuyu. While Derinkuyu is the deepest, it is not alone. Just 10 kilometers away lies Kamakli, another underground city. It is less deep but wider, a sprawling labyrinth of over 100 tunnels. For years, rumors persisted of a tunnel connecting the two cities, a superhighway, 9 kilometers long, buried beneath the earth, allowing refugees to flee from one city to the other if a breach occurred. While modern collapses make it impossible to verify the full length today, sections of such tunnels have been found. This implies that we are not looking at isolated bunkers. We are looking at a subterranean nation. A federal system of hidden cities, connected by arteries of darkness, sharing air, water, and intelligence. As we leave the engineering marvels of the ancient world, we must move forward in time. The ancients went underground to escape armies. But centuries later, in a very different part of the world, men would go underground not to save their lives, but to listen to the voice of God. And sometimes, the voice they heard in the dark drove them mad. The Persian Pursuit. The March of the 10,000. To understand what life was actually like inside these cities, not the archaeology, but the human experience, we have a rare and precious eyewitness account. It comes from Xenophon, the Greek historian and soldier. The year is 401 BC. Xenophon is leading the 10,000, a mercenary army of Greek hoplites. They are retreating from a failed campaign in Persia, marching through the hostile, freezing highlands of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. They are starving. They are freezing to death in the snow. They are being hunted. Desperate for shelter, they stumble upon the local Anatolian tribes. But they don't find cities with walls and towers. They find holes in the ground. Xenophon writes in his Anabasis. The houses were underground, with a mouth like that of a well, but below they were spacious. The entrances for the animals were dug out, but the men descended by a ladder. In these houses were goats, sheep, cows, poultry, and their young, and all the animals were reared and took their fodder there in the houses. This is the first written record of the underground cities. And for the Greeks, used to the sun-drenched agoras of Athens, it was a culture shock. A banquet in the earth. What Xenophon describes next destroys the image of these people as terrified refugees cowering in the dark. He describes a party. The locals invite the freezing Greeks down into their homes. They descend the ladders, leaving the biting wind behind. Down in the tuff, the air is warm. The smell is strong, animals and unwashed bodies, but it is the smell of life. Xenophon describes large bowls filled with barley wine, a primitive beer. Floating on top of the wine were barley grains, and floating in the bowls were reeds of various sizes, like straws without joints. When one was thirsty, he had to take these reeds into his mouth and suck. The beverage without the admixture of water was very strong, and of a delicious flavor to certain palates, but the taste had to be acquired. Here, 2,400 years ago, deep underground, we have the first recorded instance of using a straw to drink beer. The scene is surreal. Hardened Greek killers, heavily armored, sitting cross-legged on the floor of a cave, sucking beer through reeds with local farmers, surrounded by chewing cows and bleating goats. It highlights a crucial aspect of the underground cities. They were cozy. They had clay amphorae filled with butter, nuts, and salted meat. They had woven rugs on the cold stone floors. They had a society that functioned perfectly without the sun. The psychological toll. However, Xenophon was a guest passing through. For the permanent residents, the darkness took a toll. Later historical accounts and skeletal analysis give us a darker picture. Living underground for months caused vitamin D deficiency. Rickets was common. The smoke, despite the clever ventilation, caused anthracosis, black lung disease, usually seen in coal miners. And then there was the fear. The defenses of Derinkuyu, the rolling stone doors, were not just for show. They were used. We can imagine the scene when the alarm sounded. At peacetime, mode of beer and rugs would vanish instantly. The livestock would be muzzled to prevent them from making noise. The lamps would be extinguished or covered, plunging the city into a twilight gloom to save oxygen and oil. The children would be gathered in the deepest rooms, the safe zones, past the first 2 choke points. And the men would stand by the rolling stones with their spears. The trap. The design of the tunnels was sadistic. The corridors were narrow and low. An attacking soldier, carrying a shield and sword, would have to bend double. He could not raise his shield to protect his head. He could not swing his sword effectively. He would be walking blindly into the dark. Suddenly, the floor would drop away, a hidden pitfall trap. Or, he would turn a corner and face a solid stone wheel blocking his path. As he struggled to push it, a spear would thrust through the central hole, impaling him. If the attackers tried to burn them out by throwing fire down the shafts, the defenders could block the lower sections of the shafts, sealing themselves off until the fire burned out. It was a stalemate of stone. Xenophon and his men eventually left, marching onward to the Black Sea. They left the underground dwellers to their silence. But the memory of that warmth in the earth stayed with the Greeks. It was a reminder that civilization is not defined by how high you build your towers, but by how deep you can dig your roots. As we move from the tactical survival of Anatolia to the mystic silence of the Mediterranean, we encounter a different kind of underground. In Malta, they didn't dig to hide from Persians. They dug to hide from the noise of the living world, to create a chamber that vibrated with the frequency of the gods. The Hypogeum of Malta. The house builders of the Stone Age. We leave the dusty plains of Anatolia and cross the Mediterranean Sea to the small, sun-baked archipelago of Malta. Here, on a hill overlooking the grand harbor in the town of Paula, sits an ordinary street. There are houses, cars, and the mundane noise of modern life. But in 1902, construction workers digging a cistern for a new housing development broke through the limestone floor. They didn't hit water. They hit a void. They had accidentally smashed through the roof of one of the most enigmatic structures on Earth, the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum. Unlike Derinkuyu, which was built for survival, the Hypogeum was built for the soul. Dating back to around 4000 BC, predating the Great Pyramid of Giza by over 1,000 years and Stonehenge by even longer, this was not a city of the living. It was a cathedral of the dark. The people who built this, the temple builders of Malta, possessed no metal tools. They used antlers, flint, and obsidian. And yet they carved a 3-level complex deep into the Globigerina limestone that mimics the architecture of the surface world in stunning detail. It is architecture in negative. Instead of stacking stones to build a column, they carved the rock away until only a column remained. They carved false windows, trilithons, and corbelled ceilings, imitating the megalithic temples they built above ground. It is a ghost temple, inverted into the earth. The Sleeping Lady? As excavators cleared the debris of centuries, the site had been used as a necropolis, eventually holding the remains of over 7,000 people. They found an artifact that has become the symbol of Malta. It is a small clay figurine, no larger than a human hand. She is known as the Sleeping Lady. She lies on her side on a woven couch, her head resting on her arm. She is voluptuous, with wide hips and thick skirts, echoing the mother goddess figures of the era. But it is her posture that haunts us. She is not dead. She is not posing. She is dreaming. Archaeologists and historians believe she offers the key to the Hypogeum's true purpose. This was not just a place to dump bodies. It was a place of incubation. In ancient Mediterranean cultures, incubation was a ritual where a person would sleep in a sacred place to receive a dream from the gods, a cure for an illness, a prophecy, or advice from the ancestors. The Hypogeum was likely a massive sensory deprivation tank. Imagine the descent. You are a Neolithic initiate. You leave the blinding Mediterranean sun and crawl down into the cool, damp limestone. You pass the red ochre spirals painted on the ceilings, spirals that symbolize the eternal cycle of life and death. You descend to the Holy of Holies, on the second level. It is pitch black. You lie down among the bones of your ancestors. You wait for the vision. But the vision was not just triggered by darkness. It was triggered by sound. The oracle room. On the second level of the hypogeum, there is a small, carved niche in the wall known as the oracle room. For decades, guides claimed that if a man with a deep voice spoke into the niche, the sound would echo throughout the entire complex. But if a woman spoke, it would not. This was often dismissed as folklore or tourism flair. But in recent years, acoustical scientists have brought equipment down into the dark to test the room. What they found was startling. The room is tuned. It is a giant musical instrument. When a voice chants at a specific pitch, around 110 Hz, a low baritone range, the room resonates violently. The sound waves bounce off the curved limestone walls, creating a standing wave. The sound doesn't just enter your ears, it vibrates through your bones. You feel it in your chest. Neuroscientists have studied the effect of 110 Hz on the human brain. The results are profound. When exposed to this frequency, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for language processing and logical thought, starts to shut down. Simultaneously, the parts of the brain associated with mood, empathy, and social behavior light up. Essentially, the frequency induces a trance state. The builders of the hypogeum, 6,000 years ago, without knowledge of neurology or wave physics, had empirically discovered how to hack the human brain. The ritual of resonance. Reconstruct the scene. A high priest stands in the oracle niche. The initiates are lying in the chambers nearby, perhaps clutching clay figures of the sleeping lady. The priest begins to chant. He hits the resonant frequency. Om. Om. The sound amplifies. It becomes a physical weight in the air. The walls seem to hum. In the pitch blackness, the initiates' logical minds, the part that worries about crops and weather, shut down. They drift into a theta wave state, the borderland of sleep and waking. In this state, the barrier between the living and the dead dissolves. The 7,000 ancestors buried around them are no longer gone. They are present. The red spirals on the ceiling seem to spin. The dream comes. It was a technology of the sacred. The mystery of the disappearance. The civilization that built the hypogeum thrived for over 1,000 years. They were peaceful. No weapons of war have ever been found in their temples. They were artistic, spiritual, and industrious. And then, around 2500 BC, they vanished. The temple building stopped. The hypogeum was sealed. A new culture, with different pottery and cremation practices, the Tarxian cemetery culture, appeared on the islands. Did the temple builders succumb to a plague? A famine caused by drought? Or did their obsession with the underground, with the dream world, lead to their societal collapse? Some historians suggest they exhausted the island's resources to build these massive monuments, starving themselves to feed their gods. Today, the hypogeum is strictly protected. The carbon dioxide from visitors' breath dissolves the limestone walls, so only 80 people are allowed in per day. It is a fragile environment. But if you are lucky enough to go down, and you stand in the oracle room, you can still feel the heaviness of the air. You are standing inside a prehistoric machine designed to bridge the gap between matter and mind. The hypogeum teaches us that the underground is not just a place to hide the body, Derinquia. It is a place to free the spirit. But not all rock-cut cities were hidden. Some were built to be seen, to be awe-inspiring displays of power that glittered in the sun before burying their secrets in the shade. Our next stop takes us to the desert of Jordan, to a city of rose-red stone that hides a plumbing system, and a basement that few tourists ever see. Petra's hidden basements. The Hollywood illusion. If you close your eyes and picture Petra, you almost certainly see one specific image, the treasury, Al-Khazna. You see the towering facade, glowing rose-red in the Jordanian sun, carved directly into the sandstone cliff face. You might imagine Indiana Jones galloping out of the canyon, or the silence of the narrow gorge known as the Sick that leads up to it. It is one of the most famous buildings on Earth. But for 2 centuries, we looked at it wrong. We thought we were looking at the ground floor. We were actually looking at the second story. In 2003, a team of archaeologists led by Dr. Suleiman Farajat noticed something odd about the ground in front of the treasury. It was uneven, packed with centuries of flood debris and sand. They decided to dig. Tourists watched in confusion as the team excavated downward right in front of the famous door. As they removed the compacted sand, the smooth rock face of the treasury didn't stop. It kept going down. They uncovered a flight of stairs buried for 2 millennia. These stairs led to a set of iron-grated tombs beneath the treasury. The famous structure was not a standalone monument. It was the crown of a vertical complex. The street level we had walked on for centuries was merely the accumulated dust of history covering the true entrance. This discovery changed the narrative of Petra. It reminded us that what we see of the Nabatean capital is only the attic. The house itself is buried. The Nabatean illusionists. The Nabateans, the Arab tribe who built Petra around the 3rd century BC, were master illusionists. They were nomads who became kings of the incense route, controlling the flow of frankincense and myrrh from Arabia to Rome. They were fabulously wealthy, and they used that wealth to carve a city that defied the desert. But their greatest magic trick was not the carving of stone. It was the carving of water. Petra receives only about 6 inches of rain a year. Yet, it supported a population of 30,000 people, filled swimming pools, and sustained lush gardens. How? They built a subterranean city of water. If you walk through the Sikh today, the narrow, winding canyon that serves as the entrance, look closely at the walls. Running along the sides, often hidden by overhanging rock or eroded by time, are channels carved into the stone. These were the aqueducts. The Nabateans understood that in the desert, water is heavier than gold. They didn't just collect rain, they harvested it. They engineered a vast network of underground cisterns, some the size of basketball courts, lined with waterproof plaster. These cisterns were hidden beneath the city streets, invisible to invaders. When the Romans besieged Petra, they expected the city to thirst to death in days. They didn't know that beneath their feet lay millions of gallons of cool, stored water. The ceramic veins. The sophistication of this system was microscopic. Archaeologists have excavated miles of terracotta piping buried inside the cliffs. These pipes were designed with precise gradients to maintain water pressure without bursting the clay. They used particle filtration systems, settling basins, to ensure the water arriving in the city center was free of the desert sand. But the most dramatic engineering was the anti-flood system. The Sikh is essentially a funnel. When rare desert rains fall, they hit the hard-baked earth and rush into the canyon, creating flash floods that can snap trees and drown tourists even today. The Nabateans knew this. They carved a massive tunnel, 88 meters, 290 feet, long, through solid rock at the entrance of the city to divert the flash floods around Petra rather than through it. This dark tunnel is still there, a testament to a civilization that refused to be at the mercy of the weather. The city of the living. Because Petra is famous for its tombs, the royal tombs, the treasury, which was likely a mausoleum for a king like Aretas IV, we tend to think of it as a necropolis, a city of the dead. But the excavations of the Petra Garden and Pool Complex have revealed the domestic underground. The wealthy citizens of Petra lived in complex villas. These weren't just caves. They were multi-room apartments carved into the rock, complete with painted frescoes that rival Pompeii. They had underfloor heating systems, hypocausts, similar to the Romans. They had underground storage silos for grain that could keep food fresh for years. In the hillside of Al-Habis, behind the city center, there are smaller, unadorned caves. These were the suburbs. Here, the common people lived, their homes cool in the summer and warm in the winter, the rock providing insulation that no tent could match. The silence returns. The decline of Petra was slow. It wasn't destroyed by a single war, but by a shift in economics. The Romans took over, and then the trade routes shifted to the sea. The Silk Road bypassed the desert. The city bled wealth. Then came the earthquakes. Specifically, the massive quake of 363 AD, which shattered the water infrastructure. Without the hidden veins of water, the city could not live. The cisterns cracked. the pipes filled with silt. By the time the Islamic conquest swept through in the 7th century, Petra was a ghost town. It was eventually forgotten by the Western world completely, known only to the local Bedouin tribes who used the tombs as shelter for their goats and themselves, guarding the secret of the Rose City for centuries. It wasn't until 1812 that a Swiss explorer named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, disguised as an Arab scholar, tricked his guide into leading him to the lost city. He wrote of the awe and wonder of emerging from the dark sick to see the treasury. But he didn't know about the tombs beneath his feet. He didn't know he was standing on a roof. End of part 1. As we leave Petra and the ancient world, we close the first part of our journey. We have seen how the ancients used the underground. In Cappadocia, it was a fortress of survival against war. In Malta, it was a machine for spiritual transcendence. In Petra, it was a marvel of hydraulic engineering and hidden infrastructure. The ancient underground was pragmatic. It was about heat, water, defense, and gods. But as humanity moved into the Middle Ages, the relationship with the underground changed. It became less about living and more about resources. It became a place of labor, of minerals, and of penance. And, as cities in Europe began to swell beyond their walls, the ground beneath them became the only place left to put the things, and the people, nobody wanted to see. We are leaving the sun-baked rocks of the Mediterranean. We are heading north, to the damp, dark soil of Europe. We are going to the Salt Kingdom. The Salt Kingdom. The legend of the ring. In the folklore of Poland, there is a story about a princess named Kinga. In the 13th century, she was betrothed to Boleslaw the Chaste, the Prince of Krakow. Before leaving her home in Hungary, she asked her father not for gold or jewels, but for salt, a resource more valuable than gold in the medieval world, used to preserve food and sustain life. Her father gave her a salt mine in Maramuros. But Kinga couldn't transport a mine. So, she took her engagement ring and threw it down the mine shaft, praying to God. When she arrived in Poland, near Krakow, she ordered her miners to dig in a specific spot. They dug through the sand and clay until they hit hard rock salt. Inside the first lump of salt they split open, they found her engagement ring. The salt from Hungary had miraculously traveled through the earth to Poland. This is the legend. The reality of the Wieliczka salt mine is even more miraculous. The underground cathedral. Wieliczka is not just a mine. It is an underground phantom city that operated continuously from the 13th century until 2007. Over 700 years, miners dug out 300 kilometers, 186 miles, of tunnels, reaching depths of 327 meters, 1,073 feet. But these miners were not just laborers, they were artists. Spending their entire lives in the dark, constantly facing the threat of collapse or methane explosions, they turned to faith. They began to carve. The crown jewel of the mine is the Chapel of St. Kinga. It is located 101 meters underground. It is not a small prayer niche. It is a full-size church, 54 meters long and 12 meters high. Everything in this chapel is made of salt. The altar is salt. The bas-relief reproduction of Da Vinci's The Last Supper carved into the wall is salt. The floor tiles, carved with intricate geometric patterns, are salt. Even the chandeliers are made of salt crystals. The miners dissolved the rock salt and reconstituted it to be clear like glass, creating fixtures that cast a warm, ethereal glow over the sanctuary. It is a stunning example of human psychology. Surrounded by the crushing weight of the earth and the omnipresent darkness, the miners built a space of light and beauty. They brought heaven down into hell. The white death and the burners. But the beauty hides the brutality. Mining in the medieval and Renaissance periods was a death sentence. The greatest danger was methane. The miners called it the silent killer. It would seep from the rock faces, odorless and invisible, accumulating in the ceilings of the tunnels. One spark from a torch, and the tunnel would turn into a cannon barrel. To combat this, the mine employed a special class of worker known as the penitents, or crawlers. These men, often wrapped in wet rags, would crawl through the tunnels at night, holding a long pole with a burning torch at the end. Their job was to deliberately ignite the small pockets of gas near the ceiling before they became large enough to cause a massive explosion. They were human bomb squads. They crawled on their bellies, burning the air, knowing that at any moment, a pocket might be too big, and they would be incinerated. They were the guardians of the mine, clearing the path for the morning shift. The subterranean sanatorium. In the 19th century, a strange phenomenon was noticed. The miners at Wieliczka, despite the hard labor, did not suffer from the respiratory diseases common to other laborers. Their lungs were clear. They rarely had asthma or allergies. A physician named Felix Bokskowski investigated and realized that the microclimate of the mine was healing. The air was saturated with salt aerosol, free of pollutants and allergens. This led to the creation of the world's first underground sanatorium. People began to travel to Wieliczka not to work, but to breathe. They slept in the salt chambers, treating asthma and chronic bronchitis. This practice, known as speleotherapy, continues today. There is a health resort 135 meters underground where patients sleep in the cool, salty silence. The dark lake. Deeper still, past the tourist routes, lies the saline lake of Iram. The water is denser than the Dead Sea. In the dim light, it looks like black glass. During World War II, the Nazis occupied the mine. They didn't care about the salt, they cared about the depth. They used the high caverns to set up an underground aircraft engine factory, safe from Allied bombing runs. They enslaved Jewish prisoners to work the machines in the freezing dark. Wieliczka has seen it all: the piety of the medieval saints, the industry of the 19th century, and the cruelty of the 20th. Today, it stands as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But when you walk through the chapel of St. Kinga, remember, no architect drew these plans. No master builder directed the work. It was carved, inch, by exhausted men after their shift was over, using the same pickaxes they used to tear the wealth from the earth, trying to find God in the salt. The Empire of Death. The stench of the Enlightenment. Paris in the late 18th century was the center of the Western world. It was the age of Voltaire, Rousseau, and the pursuit of reason. Ladies in silk gowns walked the gardens of the Tuileries, and philosophers debated liberty in the salons. But beneath the perfume and the powder, Paris was rotting. The city had been burying its dead within the city walls since the Roman era. The cemeteries were small, hemmed in by churches and growing neighborhoods. The most notorious of these was the Cimetière des Innocents, Cemetery of the Innocents. For 600 years, it had been the primary dumping ground for the bodies of 20 parishes. It was less a cemetery and more a landfill of humanity. When a pit was full, they didn't dig a new one, they simply threw more dirt on top and kept stacking bodies. By 1780, the ground level of the cemetery had risen more than 2 meters, 6 feet, above the surrounding streets solely due to the volume of decomposing matter. It was a literal mound of death. The smell was indescribable. It was said to sour milk within minutes. It clung to the clothes of anyone who walked past. The mephitic vapors were believed to spread disease, and butchers nearby reported that meat would rot instantly. The soil was so saturated with organic humus that grave diggers reported their candles would go out from the lack of oxygen in the pits. Paris was drowning in its own ancestors. The basement of horror. The breaking point, quite literally, came in the spring of 1780. It had been a season of heavy rains. The saturated earth of Les Innocents, heavy with the weight of thousands of corpses, pressed against the foundation walls of the adjacent buildings. On May 30th, a restaurateur on the Rue de la Lingerie went down to his cellar to fetch some wine. He was met with a scene from a nightmare. The stone wall separating his basement from the cemetery had burst open. A landslide of decomposing bodies, bones, and sludge had poured into his cellar. The horror of the cellar collapse shocked the city. It wasn't just a sanitation issue anymore, it was structural. The dead were invading the homes of the living. King Louis XVI, usually indecisive, was forced to act. The Council of State decreed that the Cemetery of the Innocents be closed and emptied. But where do you put the remains of 6 million people? The Lutean void. The solution lay in the geology that had built Paris in the first place. For centuries, the Romans and the French had mined the limestone, Lutean limestone, from beneath the southern outskirts of the city to build the Notre Dame, the Louvre, and the city walls. This mining had left a sprawling, chaotic network of tunnels and caverns, over 300 kilometers of them, beneath the left bank, Montparnasse, Denfert-Rochereau. These quarries were dangerous. Indeed, entire streets in Paris had occasionally collapsed into them. But the king's lieutenant general of police, Alexander Lenoir, saw an opportunity. The voids were empty, the cemeteries were full. It was a simple equation of volume. The plan was audacious: consolidate the dead. Transform the unstable mining tunnels into a massive ossuary, a bone depository, and reinforce the city's foundations at the same time. The Black Processions. The operation began in 1786. It was a massive logistical undertaking that took 2 years of nightly labor to clear just the innocents, and decades to clear the other cemeteries. To avoid panicking the populace, and to respect the solemnity of the act, the transfers were done strictly at night. Imagine the scene. Every night at sunset, a procession of black-covered carts left the city center. They were accompanied by torchbearers and chanting priests. The wheels were likely muffled to dampen the noise on the cobblestones. These funerals of funerals wound their way south to the Brier d'Affer, the Gate of Hell, a city gate near the entrance to the quarries. There, the bones were tipped down a chute. A cascade of skulls, femurs, and ribs tumbled 60 feet down into the dark. At the bottom, workers, mostly quarrymen who were used to the dark, received the load. At this stage, there was no art, no respect, no organization. It was industrial disposal. The bones were piled in heaps, a chaotic jumble of rich and poor, plague victims and revolutionaries, saints and sinners. The quarrymen worked by the light of tallow candles. The air was thick with bone dust. The silence of the tunnels was broken only by the rattle of the chutes and the scraping of shovels. The consecration of the void. On April 7, 1786, the underground site was consecrated and officially named the Catacombs, a reference to the Roman catacombs, though those were ancient burial sites, and this was a relocation site. It was a realm separated from the world above. As the carts rumbled overhead carrying the early stirrings of the French Revolution, the dead were being united in a democracy of bone. In the pile, the nobleman's skull was indistinguishable from the beggar's. But the catacombs were not yet the tourist attraction we know today. They were a messy, terrifying dump. It would take one man, a genius of organization with a macabre artistic eye, to turn this garbage heap into a museum of death. That transformation is where the true horror and beauty of the Paris underground begins. The Bone Arrangers. The man who organized chaos. By 1810, the Paris catacombs were technically functional, but they were aesthetically repulsive. The bones lay in unstructured heaps, a sprawling landfill of calcium that terrified rather than inspired. The tunnels were unstable, the air was stagnant, and the layout was a confusing maze that had already claimed lives. Enter Louis-Étienne Héricart de Thury. Appointed as the Inspector General of Quarries, Thury was a man of the Enlightenment but with the soul of a romantic poet. He looked at the piles of shattered ancestors and saw an opportunity. He realized that the catacombs shouldn't just be a warehouse for the dead, they should be a mausoleum, a place of reverence, science, and philosophical reflection. He ordered a massive renovation that would transform the underground from a dump into a gallery. The architecture of tibias. Thury's brilliance was in his understanding of structural engineering using the only material he had in abundance, human bone. He instructed the quarrymen to stop dumping and start building. They began to sort the remains. The long bones, femurs and tibias, were separated from the smaller, irregular bones like vertebrae, ribs, and phalanges. The workers then treated the bones like masonry. They stacked the femurs horizontally, interlocking the heavy knobby ends to create stable, flat walls. These weren't just decorative, they were retaining walls. Behind these neat, stacked facades, the workers shoveled the millions of smaller, broken bones into the void, packing them tightly to support the tunnel ceiling. What tourists see today is merely the skin of the ossuary. The walls are actually the orderly front of a chaotic, dense mass of fragments extending meters back into the rock. To break the monotony of endless thigh bones, Thury ordered the workers to insert skulls at regular intervals. They created geometric patterns, lines, crosses, and diamonds embedded into the walls of femurs. It was macabre mosaic work. The quarrymen, who had spent years as simple laborers, became artists of the macabre. They built the Barrel of the Passion, a massive pillar covered in skulls, and the Rotunda of Tibias. They turned the dead into decoration. The Empire of Death. Thury understood that the descent into the underworld was a psychological journey. He wanted to curate that experience. He redesigned the entrance. He installed a heavy door with a lintel bearing a warning that would become one of the most famous inscriptions in the world. It was not a religious text, but a command. Arrête! C'est ici l'Empire de la Mort. Stop! This is the Empire of Death. Once inside, visitors would not just walk past bones, they would walk past wisdom. Thury placed stone plaques throughout the tunnels, engraved with quotes from religious texts, poets, and philosophers, Virgil, Dante, Racine. He placed them strategically. In a dark, narrow corner, you might read a line about the silence of the grave. Near a particularly large pile of skulls, a quote about the equality of all men in death. He also added the scientific context. Plaques indicated which cemetery the bones came from and the year they were moved. Bones from the cemetery of Saint Eustache, 1787. It gave the piles a geography and a history. Thury transformed the catacombs into a memento mori, a physical reminder of mortality. He turned a sanitation project into a philosophical statement. You, the living, are walking through your own future. The first tourists. The transformation was a sensation. In an era before cinema or television, the Empire of Death became the ultimate thrill for the European elite. In 1787, even before the renovations were complete, the Count of Artois, the future King Charles X, descended with a group of court ladies for a secret party. In 1814, Francis I, the Emperor of Austria, visited. In 1860, Napoleon III descended with his son. It became fashionable to shudder in the dark. But the catacombs were not a theme park. They were still a dangerous, bewildering labyrinth. While Thury had organized the ossuary, the network of tunnels stretched for hundreds of kilometers beyond the bone-filled section, deep into the unmapped quarries. And the quarries were hungry. The tragedy of Philibert Despert. No story of the Paris underground is complete without the cautionary tale of Philibert Despert. Philibert was not a king or a philosopher. He was the doorkeeper of the Val-de-Grâce Hospital during the French Revolution. On November 3, 1793, he entered the quarries. Why? Some say he was trying to find a secret route to the cellar of a nearby convent to steal their famous liqueur. Others say he was looking for treasure. He entered with a single candle. He never came out. For 11 years, his disappearance was a mystery. His wife likely waited, then mourned, then moved on. It wasn't until 1804 that a team of quarry inspectors, mapping a remote section of the tunnels far from the usual routes, found a skeleton. He was identified by the hospital keys still hanging from his belt. The posture of the bones told a horrific story. He had not died from a fall. He had died of exhaustion and starvation. He had wandered in the absolute darkness, perhaps for days, his candle long burned out, feeling his way along the cold limestone walls, screaming for help that would never come. He was only a few hundred meters from an exit when he finally lay down. In a rare act of underground chivalry, he was buried right where he was found. A tombstone stands there today, in the restricted zone of the catacombs, the Forbidden Catacombs, patrolled by the police unit known as the Cataflex. It reads, "In memory of Philibert Despert, lost in this excavation on November 3, 1793, found 11 years later and buried in the same place on April 30, 1804. He is the patron saint of the cataphiles, the modern urban explorers who illegally roam the tunnels today. His ghost is said to blow out the candles of those who disrespect the rules of the deep." The transition. As we leave Paris, we leave behind the romantic view of death. Thury and the French made death beautiful. They made it geometric, poetic, and grand. But across the English Channel, in the city of Edinburgh, the underground was not being used to glorify the dead. It was being used to hide the living. In Scotland, there was no Haricart de Thury to install poetry. There were only landlords, damp bridges, and the crushing weight of the Industrial Revolution. We are going to the vaults where the poor were swept under the rug, literally. Chapter 10: Edinburgh's Vaults. The Bridge over the Dry Valley. Edinburgh is a city of vertical deception. If you stand on the famous Royal Mile, you feel you are on solid ground. You are not. You are actually standing on the spine of a volcanic crag. To your left and right, the ground drops away into steep ravines. In the late 18th century, the city needed to expand. The solution was to build bridges, not over water, but over the land itself, connecting the high ridges of the city and spanning the deep, dirty slums of the Cowgate Valley below. The most ambitious of these was the South Bridge. Completed in 1788, it was an engineering marvel consisting of 19 massive stone arches. However, only one arch is visible today, the one spanning the Cowgate Street. The other 18 arches were completely enclosed by rising tenement buildings constructed along the sides of the bridge. The bridge effectively became a street floating in the air, and the spaces inside the hollow arches beneath it became rooms. These were the Edinburgh Vaults. Initially, these subterranean chambers were prime real estate. They were cool, secure, and located directly beneath the bustling shopping district. Wine merchants, cobblers, and smelters set up shop. But the bridge had a fatal flaw. The stone was porous, and the waterproofing, a primitive mixture of lime and lead, failed. When it rained in Edinburgh, which is constantly, the water didn't run off. It soaked through the road, filtered through the garbage and horse manure of the street, and dripped directly into the vaults below. The merchants, tired of their goods rotting in sewage rain, abandoned the vaults within 30 years. The city of the damned. When the legitimate businesses moved out, the illegitimate world moved in. By the 1820s, the vaults had transformed into the darkest slum in Great Britain. This was the era of the Highland clearances and the Irish potato famine. Thousands of desperate refugees flooded Edinburgh, finding no housing and no work. They went underground. Entire families lived in the damp, windowless arches. There was no sanitation. There was no sunlight. The air was thick with smoke from peat fires that had no chimney to escape, mixing with the stench of the night soil, human waste, that piled up in the corners. It became a lawless zone. The Edinburgh police refused to go down there. It was a city beneath a city, governed by gangs and consumed by misery. Historical records suggest that gambling dens and illegal whiskey distilleries thrived in the back rooms, while the front rooms housed families of 10 sleeping on a single pile of straw. The death rate was catastrophic. If the cholera didn't get you, the tuberculosis did. The resurrection men. The darkness of the vaults attracted predators. The most infamous period of Edinburgh's history, the era of the resurrection men, is tightly woven into the lore of the underground. In the 1820s, Edinburgh was the world capital of medical science. The anatomy schools needed fresh cadavers for dissection. But the law only allowed them to use the bodies of executed criminals, which were in short supply. Supply and demand created a gruesome market. Resurrection men would dig up fresh graves and sell the bodies to the doctors. The most notorious pair, William Burke and William Hare, skipped the digging part. They realized it was easier to create the corpses themselves. They murdered at least 16 people in 1828. While Burke and Hare operated mostly out of a lodging house in the Westport, local legend and some historical evidence suggest the vaults played a role in the trade. The labyrinthine tunnels were the perfect place to store a body before transport, or to hunt for a victim who wouldn't be missed. In a place where people died daily of disease and neglect, a fresh corpse raised no eyebrows. The vaults became a place where a person could simply vanish. To go under the bridge was to disappear from the census of the living. The time capsule. By the mid-19th century, the conditions in the vaults became too horrific even for the Victorian authorities. The landlords, embarrassed by the squalor or perhaps fearing the collapse of the buildings above, filled the vaults with rubble and sealed them off. For over 100 years, they were forgotten. Edinburgh walked over them, drove over them, and lived on top of them, unaware of the history buried beneath the tarmac. They were rediscovered by accident in the 1980s. A former Scottish rugby player named Norrie Wilson, who owned a bar on the street above, found a hollow wall in his basement. Curiosity got the better of him. He broke through. He didn't just find a room, he found a lost world. Because the vaults had been sealed so abruptly, they were full of artifacts. Excavators found clay pipes, oyster shells, the fast food of the Victorian poor, children's toys, and medicine bottles. They found the charred remnants of fires and the rusted tools of the tradesmen. The presents. Today, the vaults are open for tours, but they retain a heavy, oppressive atmosphere. Visitors frequently report physical sensations, sudden drops in temperature, the feeling of being watched, or phantom touches. The most famous resident is a malevolent entity known as the Watcher, or Mr. Boots, said to be the spirit of a tyrannical landlord or a guard who patrolled the slums. Whether one believes in ghosts or not, the horror of the vaults is real. It is the horror of poverty. Standing in those dripping stone arches, you realize that the underground was not always a choice for defense or religion. For the poorest of the poor, the underground was the only place the world would let them exist. We have journeyed through the spiritual and the macabre. We have seen the underground as a church, Wielixka, a fortress, Orvieto, a grave, Paris, and a slum, Edinburgh. But as the 19th century progressed, the world changed. The Industrial Revolution exploded. Cities became machines. And machines need pipes, wires, and waste disposal. The underground was about to be conquered by engineers. The shovel was replaced by the tunnel boring machine. The chaotic darkness was about to be lit by gaslight and then electricity. We are entering Part 3, the industrial underbelly. Our first stop is the city that was drowning in its own filth, until one man decided to build a river beneath it. We are going to London. The London sewers, the cathedral of filth. The summer of the Great Stink. It is the summer of 1858. London is the capital of the largest empire the world has ever known. It commands trade, armies, and politics across the globe. But at its heart, the city is being defeated by its own waste. For centuries, London's sanitation strategy was simple: dump it in the river. The River Thames was the city's primary water source, but it was also its primary toilet. By the mid-19th century, the population had exploded to over 2.5 million, and the river had become a thick, black, fermentation vat of human excrement, slaughterhouse offal, and industrial chemicals. Then came the heat wave. In July 1858, temperatures soared. The water level of the Thames dropped, leaving miles of sewage-soaked mud baking in the sun. The smell was apocalyptic. It was so intense that it was physically nauseating. It became known as the Great Stink. The crisis reached the halls of power. The Houses of Parliament, located right on the riverbank, became uninhabitable. The windows were draped with curtains soaked in chloride of lime to mask the odor, but it was useless. MPs were seen running from committee rooms with handkerchiefs over their faces. There was serious talk of moving the government to Oxford or St. Albans. But the smell was not just a nuisance, it was a harbinger of death. London was being ravaged by cholera. While scientists like Dr. John Snow were beginning to prove that cholera was waterborne, the prevailing belief was still the miasma theory, that disease was caused by bad air. The terror of the smell finally forced Parliament to act. In a record 18 days, they passed a bill giving the Metropolitan Board of Works enormous power and £3 million, a staggering sum at the time, to fix the river. They turned to a civil engineer named Joseph Bazalgette. 2. The Master Plan. Bazalgette was a man of quiet determination and immense vision. He didn't just want to patch the system, he wanted to revolutionize it. His plan was simple in concept but titanic in execution. He would stop the sewage from flowing into the Thames within the city limits. Instead, he would construct a series of massive, intercepting sewers, running parallel to the river. These sewers would catch the flow from the existing street drains before it hit the river and transport it miles downstream to the east, to Beckton and Crossness, where it would be treated, rudimentarily, and released into the Thames on the ebbing tide, washing it out to the North Sea. It was the single largest civil engineering project in the world at that time. The Cathedral of Ironwork. The statistics of the construction are mind-bending. Bazalgette's army of navvies, laborers, dug through the clay and gravel of London for 16 years. They used 318 million bricks. They excavated 3.5 million cubic yards of earth. They laid 1,100 miles of street sewers and 82 miles of main intercepting sewers. The tunnels were not round pipes. They were egg-shaped. This was a crucial design choice. An egg shape, narrower at the bottom, increases the speed of the flow when water levels are low, making the sewers self-cleaning. The faster the water moves, the less sediment settles. But the true marvels were the pumping stations. London is a basin. Gravity can only move water so far before the sewer gets too deep underground to be practical. To solve this, Bazalgette built massive steam-powered pumping stations to lift the sewage from the deep tunnels up to the outfall levels. He didn't build industrial sheds. He built temples. Abbey Mills Pumping Station in East London is known as the Cathedral of Sewage. Inside, it is a masterpiece of Victorian Byzantine architecture. It features intricate ironwork shaped like flowers and vines, gold-leafed columns, and soaring domes. It looks like a Russian Orthodox church, but instead of an altar, it houses massive beam engines designed to pump human waste. At Crossness, on the south bank, the engines were named Victoria, Prince Consort, Albert Edward, and Alexandra. These iron giants, weighing nearly 50 tons each, were treated with the reverence of royalty. It was a statement: even the darkest, dirtiest function of the city deserved to be elevated by art and engineering. Reshaping the surface. Bazalgette didn't just work underground. He changed the map of London above ground. To fit the massive low-level intercepting sewers along the river, he couldn't dig up the existing chaotic riverbanks. So, he built into the river. He reclaimed 22 acres of land from the Thames mud. This became the Victoria Embankment, the Albert Embankment, and the Chelsea Embankment. If you walk along the Thames today, past the Cleopatra's Needle and the nice gardens, you are walking on top of Bazalgette's roof. Beneath your feet, in a neatly stacked layer cake, lie the massive intercepting sewer. The district line of the London Underground, which was built simultaneously. Gas and water mains. He solved the traffic problem by creating new roads, the transit problem, the subway, and the poop problem, all in one stroke. The legacy of health. The system officially opened in 1865, though work continued until 1875. The effect was immediate. The great stink vanished. The Thames began to recover. Most importantly, the cholera epidemics that had killed tens of thousands of Londoners stopped and never returned. Historians argue that Joseph Bazalgette saved more lives than any other Victorian official, more than any doctor, general, or politician. The most terrifying part of Bazalgette's legacy? It is still in use. If you flush a toilet in central London today, that water travels through the same brick tunnels laid by those navvies in the 1860s. Bazalgette famously calculated the population growth of London, doubled it, and then built the pipes twice as big as that. "We're only going to do this once," he said. Because of his foresight. Over-engineering. The system lasted 150 years. Only now, in the 21st century, with London's population nearing 9 million and high-rises dominating the skyline, is the system finally reaching capacity, prompting the construction of the new Thames Tideway Tunnel, the super sewer. Bazalgette proved that the underground was not just a place to hide things. It was a machine that could save civilization from itself. But across the Atlantic, in the wild, rugged terrain of the American Northwest, a different kind of underground was forming. In London, they dug down to solve a problem. In Seattle, they didn't dig down. They simply raised the ground up, and forgot to tell the people living on the bottom floor. Seattle Underground, the city on stilts. The glue pot. Before it was a tech giant, Seattle was a mistake. Founded in the mid-19th century on the tidal flats of Elliott Bay, the early city was built essentially on sawdust and soup. The ground was so low and waterlogged that it was impossible to build a solid foundation. When the tide came in, the sewers, which were just hollowed-out logs, would back up. It was a common and horrifying occurrence for a toilet on the ground floor to suddenly erupt like a geyser, shooting sewage back into the house. The streets were worse. They were made of mud that was famously described as a glue pot. There were stories of dogs and even horses drowning in the potholes of Pioneer Square. Seattle was a soggy, smelly, wooden frontier town waiting for a disaster. On June 6, 1889, it arrived. An assistant in a cabinet shop melted a pot of glue over a turpentine fire. The glue boiled over. The fire spread to the sawdust on the floor. Within hours, the Great Seattle Fire had consumed 25 city blocks. The wooden city, dried out by an unusually warm spring, vanished in smoke. But while the citizens mourned, the city engineers saw a golden opportunity. They had a blank slate. They decided they would never deal with the tide floods or the glue pot, mud again. They made a radical decision. They wouldn't just rebuild the city. They would raise it. The Great Regrade. The plan was audacious. The city council decreed that the streets in the Pioneer Square district would be raised by anywhere from 12 to 30 feet. They would build massive retaining walls along the sides of the streets, and fill the space in between with dirt sluiced down from the nearby hills. However, there was a problem of timing. The merchants and shop owners, desperate to get back to business, refused to wait for the city to finish the massive earth-moving project. They started rebuilding their shops immediately on the old ground level, using stone and brick this time, by law. So, the buildings went up at the original low level. Meanwhile, the city built the retaining walls for the new streets around the buildings. The result was a surreal, Escher-like cityscape. The era of ladders. For several years in the 1890s, Seattle was a two-tiered city. The streets were essentially long, earthen walls, 15 feet high. The sidewalks and shop entrances were down in the canyons, between the street and the building. If you wanted to cross the street, you had to walk out of a shop, climb a steep wooden ladder up the side of the retaining wall to the dusty street, dodge the horse-drawn wagons, walk across, and then climb another ladder down to the sidewalk on the other side. It was dangerous. Drunks frequently fell off the ladders or tumbled from the street into the moat-like sidewalks below. It was clear this couldn't last. The waffle effect. The final step was to bridge the gap. The city built brick arches spanning from the retaining walls of the street to the facades of the buildings. They laid pavement on top of these arches. Suddenly, the moat was covered. The ladders were gone. The sidewalks were now level with the street. But this created a bizarre architectural anomaly. The original ground floor of every building in Pioneer Square, the floor with the nice lobby, the bank teller windows, and the main entrance, was now underground. The merchants didn't want to lose that space. So, they simply moved their main entrances up to the second floor, which was now at street level. The old ground floor became the basement. But these weren't normal basements. They were fully finished storefronts. They still had windows, doors, and elaborate molding. They just looked out into a dark, brick-lined tunnel that ran beneath the sidewalk. The purple light. To provide some light to these subterranean walkways, the builders installed vault lights in the new sidewalks above. These were grids of glass prisms set into iron frames. The glass was originally clear, but over decades, the manganese in the glass reacted with UV sunlight and turned a beautiful, deep amethyst purple. Even today, if you walk around Pioneer Square and look down, you will see these purple grids. You are walking on the roof of the original city. The underworld economy. For a while, the underground remained active. The tunnels were used by pedestrians to avoid the rain. Businesses used the lower levels for storage or bargain basements. But in 1907, the bubonic plague hit San Francisco. fear spread to Seattle. The dark, damp, rat-infested tunnels of the underground were condemned by the health department. The city ordered them vacated and sealed. However, vacated is a relative term. While the respectable businesses moved upstairs, the underground became the domain of the illicit. During Prohibition in the 1920s, the Seattle Underground was the perfect place for a speakeasy. It was a labyrinth where you could move booze unseen by the police above. It became a city of vice. Flophouses for the homeless, opium dens for the sailors, and gambling halls thrived in the dusty, gaslit corridors. It was the place where you went if you didn't want to be found. The Resurrection. By the 1950s, the underground was a forgotten time capsule, filled with the debris of the Victorian era, rusted sewing machines, rotting bars, and old bank vaults. It was saved by a local humorist, an historian named Bill Spidell. In 1965, he started leading tours through the dusty ruins, telling the scandalous history of the city, focusing on the seamstresses, a euphemism for prostitutes, who had paid taxes that built the city's schools. The Underground Tour became a sensation. It revitalized Pioneer Square and reminded Seattle that its foundation was literally built on a cover-up. Walking through the Seattle Underground today is a disorienting experience. You stand in front of a shop window that hasn't seen the sun in 120 years. You see the massive timber beams that hold up the modern world. It is a reminder that cities are not static. They are layers of ambition, one piled on top of the other. But while Seattle's underground was an accident of engineering, our next stop was an underground of intention. It was a network of tunnels built not to raise the street, but to steal men. We are traveling south to Portland, Oregon, to the infamous Shanghai tunnels. The Shanghai tunnels, the trapdoors of Portland. The wickedest port. In the late 19th century, Portland, Oregon, was not the quirky, coffee-loving city it is today. It was a gritty, muddy port town carved out of the dense fir forests, earning it the nickname Stumptown. But to the sailors of the world, it had a darker reputation. They called it the Forbidden City of the West. Portland's location was its curse. Situated on the Willamette River near the confluence with the Columbia, it was a vital hub for grain and lumber exporting. However, the journey to get there was treacherous. Ships had to cross the Columbia River Bar, the graveyard of the Pacific, and the voyage from Europe or the East Coast around Cape Horn took months. Sailors hated the run. The pay was low, the food was rotten, and the captains were brutal. Once a ship docked in Portland, the crew would often desert immediately to head for the gold fields or simpler work in the logging camps. This created a labor crisis. Captains had ships full of cargo but no men to sail them. They were willing to pay blood money to anyone who could provide a crew. This demand birthed a criminal industry known as Shanghaiing. And nowhere was it more industrialized than in the underground of Portland. The trapdoor spiders. The north end of Portland, now Old Town Chinatown, was a rowdy district of saloons, brothels, and boarding houses. Beneath these buildings lay a network of basements connected by tunnels. Originally, these tunnels were likely built for legitimate reasons, to move goods from the docks to the basement storage of shops without clogging the muddy streets. But the crimps, the men who kidnapped sailors, repurposed them into a human trafficking conveyor belt. The legend of the Shanghai tunnels describes a terrifying efficiency. A sailor would walk into a saloon like the Erickson Saloon, which boasted a 684-foot bar, the longest in the world. He would order a drink. The bartender, working with the crimps, would slip a Mickey Finn into the glass, a cocktail spiked with chloral hydrate or laudanum. As the sailor grew groggy, he wouldn't just slump over the bar. In some establishments, unsuspecting patrons allegedly stood on deadfalls, trapdoors built into the floor. A lever was pulled, the floor dropped out, and the sailor plummeted into the basement below. He would land on a mattress or a pile of sawdust unconscious. The trapdoor would snap shut. The music in the bar would play on. The king of crimps. The villains of this underground world were larger than life. The most notorious was Joseph Bunko Kelly. Bunko Kelly was a monster with a flair for the dramatic. He stood over 6 feet tall and was known for his flying squadron of thugs who would patrol the waterfront. He didn't just drug men, he tricked them with bizarre creativity. There is a famous, possibly apocryphal, story that defines his legend. One night, Kelly found a cigar store Indian, a wooden statue, that had been washed away by a flood and was floating in the river. In the dim gaslight, it looked like a man. Kelly fished it out, wrapped it in a blanket, and carried it to a desperate ship captain who was leaving at dawn. "He's dead drunk," Kelly told the captain. "Won't wake up until you're past the bar." The captain paid $50 for the sailor. Kelly vanished into the night. When the captain tried to wake his new crewman the next morning and discovered he had bought a block of wood, Kelly was already spending the money. On another horrific occasion, Kelly reportedly found a group of men who had consumed embalming fluid, mistaking it for alcohol, in the basement of a funeral home. Most were dead or dying. Kelly loaded the bodies onto a cart and sold them to a ship as deep sleepers. The captain didn't realize he had a crew of corpses until he was miles downriver. The delivery system. Once a victim was trapped in the basement, the tunnels came into play. Dragging a drugged or beaten man through the streets to the docks was risky, even in a lawless town. The police might interfere, unless they were paid off, which they usually were, or rival crimps might steal the cargo. The tunnels provided a secure route. The unconscious men were dragged through the damp, brick-lined catacombs that ran beneath the streets, leading directly to the river's edge. Inside the tunnels there were holding cells. These were cramped, barred rooms where men were kept if there wasn't a ship immediately available. They were stripped of their boots, to prevent running, and their clothes, left in rags until the crimps struck a deal. When a ship was ready, the men were hauled out to the waterfront, rowed out to the vessel, and hoisted aboard like sacks of wheat. They would wake up hours later, with a splitting headache, the coast of Oregon fading into the mist behind them. They were now sailors, legally bound to the ship for a voyage of 2 or 3 years. If they refused to work, they were beaten or thrown overboard. Legend versus reality. Today, historians debate the extent of the tunnel usage. Skeptics argue that while Shanghaiing was definitely real, the trapdoor stories might be exaggerated folklore. They suggest that most men were simply drugged or beaten in the alleyways and that the tunnels were mostly for cargo. However, the physical evidence is compelling. Tours of the Portland Underground today reveal bricked-up archways, rusted remnants of holding cells, and strange, dead-end spaces that seem to have no commercial purpose. Whether every story of Bunko Kelly is true or not, the atmosphere of the tunnels confirms a dark reality. Portland was a city built on the commodification of human beings. The underground was the mechanism that turned a man into $50 of blood money. Transition. As we leave the rough-and-tumble West Coast, we return to the East. But we are moving forward in time and ambition. In Portland, the underground was a secret. In New York City, the underground was about to become the biggest public spectacle on Earth. But before the famous New York subway system we know today was built, there was a first attempt. A secret, pneumatic attempt that looked more like a sci-fi novel than public transport. We are going to visit the mole people of New York, but first, we must visit the forgotten tube of Alfred Ely Beach. New York's mole people. The secret tube of Alfred Ely Beach. Before the rattling steel trains of the MTA defined New York City, there was a secret, silent dream buried beneath Broadway. In the late 1860s, Manhattan was choking. The streets were gridlocked with horse-drawn carriages, omnibuses, and carts. The noise was deafening, and the manure was ankle-deep. Alfred Ely Beach, the editor of Scientific American, had a vision to save the city, a pneumatic subway. He imagined trains moving like documents in a bank tube, pushed by air pressure. But Beach had a problem. William Boss Tweed, the corrupt leader of Tammany Hall, controlled the city's streetcars and refused to sanction any competition. So, Beach did what any enterprising New Yorker would do: he lied. He applied for a permit to build a small pneumatic tube for mail delivery. Tweed approved it, thinking it was a minor postal project. But under the cover of night, Beach's men began digging a tunnel large enough for humans beneath the corner of Broadway and Warren Street. They worked in secret for 58 nights. When they were finished in 1870, Beach invited the press and threw open the doors. New York was stunned. This was not a dark, dirty hole. It was a Victorian parlor. The waiting room was adorned with frescoes, a grand piano, a fountain filled with goldfish, and zircon lamps. Visitors paid 25 cents to board a cylindrical wooden car upholstered in plush velvet. A massive 48-ton fan, the Western Tornado, would blow air into the tunnel, gently pushing the car down the single block of track. Then, the fan would reverse, sucking the car back to the station. It was a sensation. 400,000 people rode it in the first year. But despite its popularity, Boss Tweed was furious. He used his political muscle to block the expansion. Then came the Panic of 1873, and the funding dried up. Beach's pneumatic dream was boarded up. For 40 years, it was forgotten. It wasn't until 1912, when workers were digging the modern BMT subway line, that they smashed through a wall and found the rotting remains of the velvet car, still sitting on its track, a ghost of a future that never happened. The Sandhogs and the Bends. When the real subway construction began in 1900, it wasn't built by wind, it was built by blood. The workers were known as Sandhogs. They were mostly Irish, Italian, and Caribbean immigrants who worked in the high-pressure caissons beneath the East River and the Hudson. Digging tunnels under a river is a war against physics. To keep the water and soft riverbed mud from rushing in and drowning the workers, the tunnels were pressurized with compressed air. The Sandhogs worked in this crushing atmosphere for hours. The danger was coming up. If they decompressed too quickly, nitrogen bubbles formed in their blood, caisson disease, or the bends. It caused excruciating joint pain, paralysis, and death. But the pressure held an even more terrifying danger, the blowout. In 1905, a Sandhog named Marshall Creech was working in a tunnel under the East River. The compressed air found a weak spot in the tunnel roof, a patch of soft mud. The air rushed out with explosive force. Creech was sucked into the hole. The air pressure behind him was so immense that it pushed his body through the mud of the riverbed, up through the water, and shot him into the air like a human cannonball. Miraculously, he survived. He landed in the river, was fished out by a boat, and lived to tell the tale. It remains one of the most impossible survival stories in construction history. The Jewel in the Dark. The first subway line opened in 1904. It was designed to be beautiful, to convince a skeptical public that going underground was safe. The crown jewel was the City Hall station. It is widely considered the most beautiful subway station ever built. It features soaring Guastavino tile arches, a self-supporting tile system, brass chandeliers, and skylights that let natural sun filter down to the platform. But beauty could not save it from geometry. The station was built on a tight loop to turn the trains around. As ridership grew, the city introduced longer cars with doors in different positions. The tight curve created a dangerous gap between the train and the platform. The station was deemed obsolete and closed to the public in 1945. It sits there today, perfectly preserved, a silent, dusty cathedral beneath the bustle of lower Manhattan. If you take the 6 train to the end of the line and stay on as it loops around to turn back uptown, you can still catch a glimpse of its ghostly arches through the window. The Freedom Tunnel. By the 1970s and 80s, the romance of the subway was gone. New York was in decline, and the underground became a place of refuge for those the city had discarded. Beneath Riverside Park on the Upper West Side runs a massive Amtrak tunnel. It was abandoned for freight use in 1980. In the silence, a community moved in. They were known as the Mole People. This was not a few scattered bedrolls. It was a shantytown. Hundreds of homeless people built permanent structures in the darkness. Some had plywood shacks with locks. Some tapped into the city's electric grid to run televisions, hot plates, and lights. They had a mayor, a code of conduct, and a community that functioned entirely separate from the surface world. They lived there for years. The Lord of the Tunnel, a man named Bernard Isaacs, became a spokesperson for this invisible society. The tunnel also became a canvas. A graffiti artist named Chris Freedom Pape discovered the massive walls were illuminated by shafts of light from street grates above. He painted haunting, Renaissance-quality murals. The Coca-Cola mural, a reproduction of Goya's The 3rd of May, and portraits of the tunnel dwellers. The tunnel was renamed the Freedom Tunnel by urban explorers. In the 1990s, Amtrak decided to reactivate the line. The shantytown was bulldozed. The mole people were evicted, forced back into the shelters or onto the streets. But for a decade, they had proved that even in the darkest, most hostile environment, humans will build a home. Transition. New York's underground is a layer cake of failed luxury, beach, dangerous industry, sandhogs, and desperate survival, the mole people. It is a place where the city's subconscious is physically manifest. But not all undergrounds are man-made tunnels. Sometimes the city is built on top of a natural labyrinth. We are leaving the granite and schist of Manhattan and heading to the Midwest. We are going to a city that used its geology to build an empire of alcohol. We are going to St. Louis, to the Beer Caves. The Beer Caves, St. Louis. The geology of lager. If you look at a geological map of St. Louis, Missouri, you will see a city built on Swiss cheese. The region sits atop a massive formation of limestone known as karst topography. Over millions of years, water has dissolved the rock, creating a sprawling, chaotic network of natural caverns beneath the streets. In the 1840s, a massive wave of German immigrants arrived in St. Louis. They brought with them their language, their music, and most importantly, their yeast. Unlike the English and Irish Alesh that Americans were used to drinking, which fermented quickly at room temperature, the Germans brought lager. The word comes from the German lagern, meaning to store. Lager yeast is delicate. It requires cool temperatures, between 35 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, to ferment properly. In the sweltering, humid summers of St. Louis, before the invention of mechanical refrigeration, brewing lager should have been impossible. The beer would spoil in days. But the Germans found the caves. They discovered that the natural caverns beneath the city maintained a constant, chilly temperature year-round. It was nature's refrigerator. The Lemp Empire. The pioneer of this subterranean industry was Adam Lemp. A grocer by trade, he started brewing his family's lager recipe in the back of his shop. When the demand outpaced his cellar, he didn't build a bigger shed, he bought a cave. Lemp purchased a property south of the city, near present-day Cherokee Street, specifically because it had a natural entrance to a massive cave system. He widened the entrance, leveled the floors, and began rolling thousands of wooden barrels into the dark. The result was the birth of the Falstaff brand and the rise of the Lemp Brewery to global dominance. At its height, the brewery covered 5 city blocks, but its true footprint was underground. Other brewers followed suit. Anheuser-Busch, Keurig, and dozens of others began buying up land over caves. They built their brew houses directly on top of the sinkholes. They installed massive spiral staircases and freight elevators to lower the wort, unfermented beer, down and hoist the finished golden lager up. St. Louis became a city floating on an ocean of beer. The Underground Social Club. The caves weren't just for barrels. On Sundays, when the breweries were closed, they became the social hub of German St. Louis. The brewers opened the caves to the public. They set up tables and chairs among the stalactites. They brought in brass bands. Families would descend into the cool earth to escape the summer heat, drinking fresh lager directly from the aging tanks while listening to polka music echoing off the limestone walls. It was a subterranean Biergarten. In the days before air conditioning, the beer caves were the coolest place in the city, literally and socially. They even built a theater underground. The Cherokee Cave had a swimming pool and a bowling alley. It was a wonderland of leisure carved out of the rock. The curse of the Lemp Caves. But the story of the Lemp Caves is not just one of industry, it is one of the great American tragedies. As refrigeration technology arrived in the 1890s, the caves became obsolete. You could now build an insulated warehouse anywhere, you didn't need the limestone. The Lemp family, however, remained tied to their underground roots. They built their family mansion directly connected to the brewery, and the caves via tunnels. The caves seemed to exert a dark gravity on the family. Despite their immense wealth, the Lemps were plagued by depression and mysterious deaths. It began with William Lemp Sr. in 1904. Devastated by the death of his favorite son Frederick, he walked into his bedroom in the mansion and shot himself. The brewery passed to his son, William Billy Lemp Jr. The lifestyle became more decadent. Billy used the caves not for lagering, but for partying. During Prohibition, the caves were rumored to be the site of illicit speakeasies and wild affairs. Legend says Billy had an illegitimate son born with Down syndrome, the monkey face boy, who was hidden away in the attic and the tunnels, never seen by the public. The tragedy continued to spiral. 1920, Elsa Lemp, William Sr.'s daughter, shot herself. 1922, the Lemp Brewery, crushed by Prohibition, was sold for a fraction of its value. The caves were sealed. 1922, Billy Lemp Jr. shot himself in the same office where his father had died. 1949, Charles Lemp, Billy's brother, shot his dog and then himself in the mansion. The Lemp Mansion is now considered one of the most haunted houses in America. The caves beneath it, once filled with music and beer, are now silent, filled only with the ghosts of a dynasty that couldn't escape the dark. The concrete cap. With the advent of modern infrastructure, the beer caves became a liability. As heavy trucks and streetcars began to rumble over St. Louis, the roofs of the forgotten caves began to collapse. Streets would suddenly swallow cars. The city embarked on a campaign to fill them in. They poured concrete and rubble into the entrances. The subterranean theater, the bowling alley, and the lagering halls were choked with debris. However, many remain. Spelunkers and city workers still occasionally break through a basement wall and find themselves in a vast, vaulted stone chamber, smelling faintly of century-old hops. We have explored the industrial underbelly. We have seen how the 19th century used the underground for waste, London, for regrading, Seattle, for crime, Portland, for transit, New York, and for brewing, St. Louis. It was an era of expansion. The underground was a tool for growth. But as the 20th century dawned, the world changed. The skies filled with bombers. The atom was split. The surface of the earth became a target. Humanity stopped digging for profit and started digging for survival. The underground became the only place where the government, the military, and the people could hide from the apocalypse. We are entering Part 4, War and Resilience. Our first stop is a basement in London, where a cigar-smoking Prime Minister held the fate of the free world in his hands while the bombs fell above. War and Resilience. The Churchill War Rooms. The bunker that wasn't. When we think of bunkers, we imagine kilometers of reinforced concrete buried deep inside a mountain, impervious to nuclear blasts. The Churchill War Rooms, Cabinet War Rooms, are terrifying precisely because they are not that. They are essentially a basement. Located beneath the Treasury building in Whitehall, just a stone's throw from 10 Downing Street, the war rooms are only about 10 feet below ground. They were reinforced with a layer of concrete known as the slab, ranging from 3 to 5 feet thick. By modern standards, and even by the standards of late World War II, this was laughably inadequate. A direct hit from a heavy German bomb would likely have penetrated the slab and killed everyone inside, including the Prime Minister, the Chiefs of Staff, and the War Cabinet. Winston Churchill knew this. The staff knew this. Yet, from 1939 to 1945, this cramped, smoky, claustrophobic basement was the brain of the British war effort. They stayed there because they had to. Leaving London would have been a signal of defeat. The map room, the analog internet. The heart of the complex was the map room. If you walk into it today, it has been preserved exactly as it was left in 1945. It feels like a shrine to analog data. The walls are covered in massive maps of the Atlantic, the Pacific, and Europe. These maps are pincushions. Every single convoy, every U-boat sighting, every Allied division was represented by a colored pin. A team of officers manned a bank of colored telephones, the Beauty Chorus, receiving intelligence from around the world. They manually moved the pins. This room was the only place on Earth where the entire global conflict could be seen at a glance. It operated 24 hours a day, non-stop, for 6 years. The lights never went out. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, stale tea, and cigarette smoke. The troglodyte life. Life underground was a strange mix of high tension and mundane bureaucracy. Hundreds of people worked there: typists, switchboard operators, generals, and politicians. They were called the troglodytes. Because of the secrecy, they often couldn't tell their families where they worked. They would disappear into a nondescript door near St. James's Park and emerge 12 hours later, pale and exhausted. They slept in sub-basement dormitories. They used sun lamps to get vitamin D. They ate rationed food in a canteen where a marshal of the Royal Air Force might sit next to a 19-year-old typist. Churchill himself had a bedroom, but he hated it. He preferred to sleep at Downing Street or the annex above ground, often watching the air raids from the roof, much to the horror of his security detail. He only slept in the bunker a handful of times, usually when the Blitz was at its absolute worst. However, he used the transatlantic telephone room constantly. Disguised as a private toilet, the door had a simple vacant/engaged lock. This tiny cupboard housed the Sixily terminal, the first encrypted voice communication system. Here, Churchill could speak directly to President Roosevelt in Washington. Imagine the Prime Minister, sitting on a small stool in a fake toilet in a basement, pleading for destroyers and supplies, his voice scrambled into white noise and reassembled across the ocean, forging the alliance that would save Europe. The noise of war. The psychological strain was immense. During the Blitz, the staff could hear the bombs falling. The building would shake. The lights would flicker. Dust would drift down from the ceiling onto the maps. But protocol dictated that work continued. There was no running, no screaming. Just the quiet click-clack of typewriters and the ringing of phones. There is a sign on the desk of the Chief of the Imperial General Staff that sums up the atmosphere. It reads simply, "Please understand there is no depression in this house and we are not interested in the possibilities of defeat. They do not exist." It was a command to ignore the reality of the shaking ceiling. The frozen moment. On August 16, 1945, the war ended. The lights in the map room were finally turned off. The staff packed their bags and left. But in a strange twist of administrative fate, the rooms weren't gutted or repurposed. The door was simply locked. The Ministry of Works essentially forgot about them. For nearly 40 years, the war rooms sat in the dark, gathering dust. The sugar cubes remained in the bowls. The maps remained on the walls with the pins showing the final front lines. Churchill's cigar butt was still in the ashtray. When the Imperial War Museum reopened them to the public in the 1980s, they didn't have to recreate the scene. They just had to turn the lights back on. The Churchill War Rooms are a testament to the fact that the most important underground spaces are not always the deepest or the strongest. They are the ones where the human will is forged. But while the British were hiding in basements to manage a war, across the globe in Vietnam, a different group of people were digging tunnels not to hide from the war, but to become the war. We are going to the Siuchi tunnels. The tunnels of Siuchi. The enemy beneath the floorboards. In 1966, the U.S. 25th Infantry Division established a massive base camp at Siuchi, a district northwest of Saigon. It was a fortress. They had tanks, artillery, helicopters, and thousands of men. They cleared the jungle, laid down asphalt, and built barracks. But they had a problem. Every night, equipment would vanish. Snipers would fire from inside the perimeter wire, and then disappear. Mortars would rain down on the mess hall, but patrols would find no launch sites. The Americans didn't know it, but they had built their base directly on top of the enemy's headquarters. Beneath the boots of the GIS lay the tunnels of Siuchi, a subterranean web stretching over 250 kilometers, 155 miles, toward the Cambodian border. It was not just a hiding spot. It was a fully functional underground city that housed thousands of Viet Cong, VC, guerrillas. The architecture of resistance. The digging began decades earlier, during the war against the French, but the Americans faced a masterpiece. The soil in Siuchi is laterite clay. In the rainy season, it is soft and workable. In the dry season, it dries as hard as concrete. The guerrillas dug by hand, using small hoes and baskets, working silently at night. They didn't just dig holes, they engineered a fortress. The tunnel system was multi-layered, often 3 or 4 levels deep. Level 1, 3 to 4 meters deep firing posts, ventilation traps, and resting areas. Level 2, 6 to 7 meters deep kitchens, dormitories, and hospitals. Level 3, 8-10 plus meters deep storage for weapons, rice, and emergency shelters against heavy bombing. The ingenuity was microscopic. The entrances were tiny, scarcely wide enough for a slender Vietnamese frame, and impossible for a large American soldier to squeeze through. They were camouflaged with leaves, termite mounds, or hidden underwater in riverbanks. The invisible kitchen. The greatest challenge underground was the same as in Derinquiu, smoke. How do you cook rice for a battalion without giving away your position to American scout planes? The solution was the Hong Kem stove. Named after the Viet Minh soldier who invented it, this stove featured a long system of underground flues. The smoke from the fire was channeled through multiple chambers, cooling it down and filtering the soot. By the time the exhaust reached the surface, meters away from the kitchen, it was merely a thin wisp of heat that dispersed immediately in the jungle foliage. They cooked hot meals right under the noses of the enemy, and the enemy saw nothing. The psychology of the trap. If the Americans did find a tunnel entrance, they faced a nightmare. The tunnels were booby-trapped with medieval cruelty. There were punji stick pits, bamboo stakes sharpened, hardened by fire, and smeared with feces or poison, hidden under false floors. There were wires trip-wired to grenades. But the most psychological weapon was nature itself. The VC would tie venomous snakes, bamboo vipers, into hollow bamboo sections or attach boxes of scorpions to the tunnel ceilings. If a soldier bumped the wrong stick or opened the wrong trapdoor, the creatures were released onto his face. The tunnel rats. The U.S. military tried everything to destroy the tunnels. They used blockbuster bombs to collapse them. They pumped water and tear gas into the shafts. They used German shepherd dogs. The VC responded by washing with American soap or using American uniforms to confuse the dog's scent. Nothing worked effectively. The only way to clear a tunnel was to go in. This task fell to a special breed of soldier known as the tunnel rats. These were usually men of smaller stature, often Puerto Rican, Mexican-American, or Filipino-American, who volunteered for the most terrifying job in the war. Armed only with a flashlight, often with a red lens to protect night vision, an AM 1911.45 pistol, rifles were too long to maneuver, they would crawl headfirst into the pitch black. Imagine the sensory horror. You are crawling through a tube scarcely wider than your shoulders. The air is stagnant and hot. You can smell the enemy, the scent of fish sauce, sweat, and unwashed bodies. You know that around the next U-turn, the tunnels were built with U-turns to stop bullets and blast waves. A guerrilla could be waiting with a spear or a gun. The combat was intimate and savage. It was knife fights in the dark. It was silence followed by a single gunshot that would rupture eardrums in the confined space. One tunnel rat described it. You couldn't think about the politics of the war. You couldn't think about home. You just thought about the 3 feet in front of you. You were hunting a ghost in its own house. The carpet bombing. Eventually, the U.S. realized they couldn't clear the tunnels man by man. They turned to the B-52 Stratofortress. They initiated Operation Cedar Falls and carpet-bombed the Iron Triangle. The sheer seismic violence of the B-52 strikes, which turned the jungle into a cratered moonscape, did manage to collapse large sections of the upper tunnels. But they never destroyed them all. The tunnels allowed the Viet Cong to control the countryside by night even when the Americans controlled it by day. They were the staging ground for the Tet Offensive in 1968, where VC troops seemed to materialize out of thin air in the heart of Saigon. The legacy of mud. Today, The Siyu-Chi tunnels are a war memorial and a tourist attraction. Visitors can crawl through widened sections of the tunnels, widened for Western tourists, to experience a fraction of the claustrophobia. But when you are down there, sweating in the humidity, touching the clay walls that still bear the pick marks of a hand tool used 60 years ago, you understand the lesson of Siyu-Chi. Technology does not always beat geography. You can have the biggest air force in the world, but if your enemy can become the earth itself, you cannot win. The Vietnamese dug to fight. But across the ocean, the American government was digging too. They weren't digging to fight, they were digging to hide. They were building the ultimate luxury fallout shelter for the only people they deemed essential, themselves. We are going to the Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia. We are going to Project Greek Island. Beijing's underground city. The chairman's order. In 1969, the world was on a knife edge. The border conflict between China and the Soviet Union over Jinbao Island had escalated to the point where nuclear war seemed imminent. Mao Zedong, the chairman of the Communist Party of China, was convinced that a Soviet surprise attack was coming. He issued a directive that would mobilize millions. Xinhua Dong Qingji Liang. Dig deep tunnels, store food everywhere. This was not a government contract given to a construction firm. It was a people's war against the bomb. The citizens of Beijing, men, women, children, and the elderly, picked up shovels and pickaxes. They dug everywhere. They dug in their backyards. They dug under shops. They dug under schools. In many cases, they didn't have heavy machinery, so they carried the dirt out in wicker baskets, dumping it in the parks or using it to make bricks. The result was Dixiaqing, the underground city. The Great Wall beneath. The scale of the project is staggering. It is estimated that 300,000 people worked on the tunnels from 1969 to 1979. They created a network that covered an area of 85 square kilometers, 33 square miles, beneath the city center. It was designed to house 40% of Beijing's population, roughly 6 million people, at a moment's notice. There were nearly 90 hidden entrances. They were located in the backs of shops, in school basements, and even under the seats in movie theaters. The idea was that once the air raid siren sounded, the entire population of Beijing could vanish from the surface within minutes. Life in the concrete womb. Unlike the Greenbrier, which was a luxury bunker for the elite, Dixiaqing was a utilitarian city for the masses. But it was surprisingly well equipped. The tunnels were about 8 to 12 meters deep, reinforced with concrete and brick, often repurposed from the demolished ancient city walls and gates of Beijing. The complex included factories, spaces for workers to continue production during the war, schools, classrooms with desks and blackboards, hospitals, fully stocked medical clinics, theaters, entertainment halls to keep morale up, mushroom farms, dark, damp chambers designed for cultivating food without sunlight, roller skating rink. Yes, there was even a recreational rink. The ventilation system was robust, designed to protect against chemical and biological weapons. Massive waterproof blast doors were installed to seal off sections in case of a breach. It was a darker, grittier mirror of the city above. It was a promise that even if Beijing was burned to ash, the People's Republic would endure in the dark. The tourist trap and the rat tribe. The war never came. The tunnels were never used for their intended purpose. In the 1980s, as China opened up under Deng Xiaoping, the underground city was commercialized. Sections were turned into cheap hotels, hostels, and markets. For a while, tourists could pay a small fee to walk through a sanitized section of the tunnels, looking at dusty portraits of Mao and rusting ammunition crates. But deeper in the labyrinth, a new demographic moved in. As Beijing's economy exploded in the 1990s and 2000s, millions of migrant workers flooded the city from the countryside. Rents on the surface skyrocketed. So, the workers went underground. They became known as the Shu, the rat tribe. Estimated to number over 1 million at its peak, the rat tribe lived in the converted bunkers and air raid shelters. These were windowless, humid cubicles, often shared by multiple people. They were cheap, costing a fraction of an apartment above ground. For years, the rat tribe was the invisible engine of Beijing. The waiters, cleaners, security guards, and construction workers who built modern Beijing slept beneath it. In 2010, citing safety concerns, and perhaps image concerns, the Beijing government banned the use of underground shelters for residential housing. The rat tribe was evicted, and the entrances were sealed. Today, Dixiaqing is largely closed. The Great Wall underground sits silent, a relic of a time when the entire nation held its breath, waiting for a flash that never happened. Transition. We move from the preparations for a hot war to the cold reality of a divided city. In Beijing, the tunnels were built to keep people in safe. In Berlin, the tunnels were dug to get people out free. We are going to the Berlin Wall. But we are not looking at the concrete barrier. We are looking at the ghostly subway stations that lay beneath it. The stations where the trains didn't stop, but the guards were always watching. We are going to the Berlin ghost stations. The Berlin ghost stations. The cut. On the night of August 12, 1961, Berlin was a single, albeit tense, city. People lived in the east and worked in the west. Lovers met across sectors. The subway trains, the U-Bahn and the S-Bahn, rattled freely between the Soviet sector and the Allied sectors. By the morning of August 13th, the city was severed. The East German government began unrolling the barbed wire that would become the Berlin Wall. But while blocking the streets was easy, you just park a tank or build a wall, blocking the underground was a logistical nightmare. The Berlin subway network was complex. Two major West Berlin lines, the U6 and U8, didn't stay in the west. They cut directly through the heart of East Berlin for several kilometers before re-emerging in the west. The East German authorities, GDR, couldn't just blow up the tunnels. They needed the infrastructure for their own lines, and disrupting West Berlin transit would have caused an international incident. So, they created one of the most surreal compromises in urban history, the Geisterbahnhof, the ghost stations. The commute through the twilight zone. For 28 years, West Berliners experienced a daily, haunting reminder of the division. Imagine getting on a train in the vibrant, neon-lit West Berlin. The train is full of people reading newspapers, heading to work. As the train approaches the sector border, the driver announces, "Last stop in the west." The train plunges into the tunnel. Suddenly, the train slows down to a crawl, a mandatory 25 kilometers per hour. You look out the window. The bright lights of the western stations are gone. You are passing through East Berlin stations, Nordbahnhof, Stadtmitte, Unter den Linden. But the train does not stop. The platforms are dimly lit by a few sickly yellow bulbs. The tile walls are grimy. The exits are bricked up. The advertising posters on the walls are frozen in time from 1961, advertisements for stockings or cigarettes that haven't existed for decades. And in the shadows you see them. The guards. East German border troops, Grenztruppen, stood on the empty platforms. They were armed with submachine guns. They weren't there to protect passengers. They were there to stop anyone from the east trying to jump onto the moving train to escape to the west. The West Berliners inside the train would stare out at the East German guards. The guards would stare back. Separated by glass and ideology, they passed each other in the dark, day after day. It was a Cold War standoff that happened every 5 minutes. The bunker of paranoia. For the East German guards, duty in the ghost stations was a special kind of hell. They were locked in. To prevent the guards themselves from jumping on a train and defecting, which happened in the early days, the GDR instituted a draconian buddy system. Guards always worked in pairs. If one tried to escape, the other was ordered to shoot him. If the other didn't shoot, he would be punished as an accomplice. The stations were booby-trapped. Pressure plates were installed on the tracks. If someone stepped on them, alarms would scream. In some tunnels, massive steel, guillotine gates, were installed that could slam shut in seconds if a breach was detected. The station master's offices were bunker-like, sealed off from the platform. The guards were prisoners of their own border. Tunnel 57. While the official stations were sealed, the soil of Berlin became a honeycomb of secret tunnels. The soft sandy soil was easy to dig, but dangerous. It collapsed easily. The most famous success was Tunnel 57. Dug in 1964 by a group of students from West Berlin, led by Wolfgang Fuchs, it ran from the basement of a disused bakery in the west, 145 meters under the death strip, to an outhouse in the courtyard of a building in the east, Strelitzer Strasse 55. It was an engineering marvel. They used a mole method, pushing the dirt back and hauling it out in crates. It took months. On the nights of October 3rd and 4th, 1964, the tunnel went operational. A courier in the east signaled the refugees. One by one, they crept into the courtyard, entered the outhouse, and crawled through the mud to freedom. 57 people escaped in 2 nights, the largest mass escape in the history of the wall. But it ended in tragedy. On the second night, East German guards discovered the tunnel. A firefight broke out. A young East German guard, Egon Schultz, was killed. The East German propaganda machine claimed he was murdered by Western agents. It wasn't until after the fall of the wall that files revealed he was actually shot by friendly fire from another East German guard in the confusion. The time capsules. On November 9, 1989, the wall fell. The barriers were overwhelmed. But opening the ghost stations took time. They had been sealed for nearly 3 decades. When the metal grates were finally pried off and the brick walls knocked down, the first people to enter found a world frozen in 1961. There were newspapers on the floor from the day the wall went up. There were ticket stubs. The air smelled of 30 years of stale dust. Reconnecting the grid was a symbolic healing of the city. As the first trains from the west finally stopped at Nordbahnhof and the doors opened, passengers stepped out onto a platform that had been a forbidden zone for half a lifetime. End of Part 4. We have seen the underground used for war. Churchill used it to command. The Viet Cong used it to fight. The U.S. Congress used it to hide. Beijing used it to prepare. Berlin used it to divide and escape. The 20th century was the era of the bunker. It was an era of fear. But we are now in the 21st century. The Cold War is over, mostly. The threats we face now are different. We face climate change. We face overpopulation. We face the need to explore other worlds. The underground is no longer just a place to hide from bombs. It is becoming a place to save the future. We are entering the final leg of our journey. Part 5, The Future Deep. Our first stop takes us to the roof of the world, to an island of ice and polar bears, where a vault buried deep in the permafrost holds the backup drive for global agriculture. We are going to the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. The Seed Vault, the Doomsday Library. The Frozen Garden of Eden. Imagine a place where the sun doesn't rise for 4 months of the year. The wind howls across a landscape of jagged mountains and glaciers. This is Spitsbergen, on the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard, just 1,300 kilometers from the North Pole. It is one of the most hostile environments on Earth. And that is exactly why we chose it to save us. Jutting out of a snowy mountainside is a rectangular concrete wedge, illuminated by a piece of public art made of mirrors and fiber optics that glows turquoise in the polar night. This is the entrance to the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, often called the Doomsday Vault. Its purpose is less Hollywood and more hard science. It is the ultimate backup drive. Across the world, there are over 1,700 gene banks, places that store seeds for crops. But these banks are vulnerable. They can be destroyed by war, as happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, by fire, as happened in the Philippines, or by lack of funding. If a crop variety is lost, it is gone forever. If a disease wipes out all the wheat in the world, and we have no backup genetic strains to breed resistance, humanity starves. So, the Global Crop Diversity Trust built a bank that is bomb-proof, flood-proof, and ignores politics. The Cathedral of Cold. To enter the vault, you must pass through 5 heavy steel security doors. You walk down a 120-meter tunnel carved deep into the sandstone mountain. The walls are reinforced with concrete, but the air already feels different. It is still. It is ancient. At the end of the tunnel lies the heart of the facility, 3 massive caverns carved into the solid rock. Inside these caverns, the temperature is kept artificially at -18 degrees Celsius -0.4 degrees Fahrenheit. But even if the power fails, even if civilization collapses and the electricity stops, the permafrost of the mountain will keep the seeds frozen at -3 degrees Celsius for centuries. It is a passive fail-safe. The shelves are lined with black plastic boxes. Inside the boxes are silver foil packets. Inside the packets are the seeds. There are over 1 million unique crop samples here. Varieties of rice from North Korea sit next to rice from South Korea. Seeds from the US sit next to seeds from Russia. Barley from the Cherokee Nation sits next to samples from Syria. In the cold dark, there are no borders. There is only Oryza sativa, rice, Triticum aestivum, wheat, and Z maize, corn. It is the United Nations of botany. The first withdrawal. The vault was designed to last 1,000 years without being opened. It was supposed to be a write-only archive. But history moves faster than we plan. In 2015, the vault received its first withdrawal request. The requester was ICARDA, the International Center for Agricultural Research in the Dry Areas. Their headquarters was in Aleppo, Syria. During the Syrian civil war, the gene bank in Aleppo became inaccessible. The scientists had managed to send backup seeds to Svalbard years earlier. Now, with their country in flames and their fields destroyed, they needed those seeds back to restart agriculture in safer locations in Lebanon and Morocco. The heavy doors of Svalbard opened. The black boxes were retrieved. The seeds were shipped back to the Middle East. It worked. The system did exactly what it was designed to do. A war destroyed the present, but the underground saved the future. The water intrusion. However, even the Doomsday Vault is not immune to the changing world. In 2017, the unimaginable happened. It rained in Svalbard in winter. Climate change had warmed the Arctic faster than anywhere else on Earth. The permafrost began to melt. Meltwater poured into the entrance tunnel of the vault. It didn't reach the seeds. The tunnel slopes downward initially but then rises up to the cathedral rooms specifically to prevent this. But the water pooled in the entrance and froze into a block of ice. It was a wake-up call. The Norwegian government spent millions to waterproof the tunnel, installing pumps and cooling pipes to artificially freeze the ground. It was a grim irony. The vault built to save us from climate catastrophe was almost breached by climate catastrophe. The silence. Standing inside the vault, few are allowed, but imagine, the silence is absolute. There is no sound of traffic, no hum of insects, no wind. You are surrounded by the potential for life. In one box, there are seeds of a bean that hasn't been grown since the Middle Ages. In another, a wild tomato from the Galapagos that might hold the genetic key to surviving a drought in 2050. It is the most valuable room on Earth. It contains no gold, no jewels, only tiny, dried husks of life. It is the ultimate testament to the underground. We put the things we cannot afford to lose in the earth. Transition. Svalbard is about storage. But what about living? As the surface of our planet heats up, as deserts expand, will we be forced to return to the caves? In the Australian outback, they already have. We are going to a town where the temperature hits 50 degrees Celsius 122 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, so the people built their houses, their churches, and their bars underground. We are going to Kuberpidi. Kuberpidi, the town built in reverse. Mars on Earth. If you drive 850 kilometers north of Adelaide into the South Australian outback, the world changes. The trees disappear. The grass disappears. The earth turns a scorched, rusty red. The horizon is flat and shimmering with heat haze. In the summer, the temperature here regularly hits 50 degrees Celsius 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Birds have been known to fall dead from the sky. It is a landscape so alien that filmmakers used it as the set for Mad Max, Beyond Thunderdome, and Pitch Black. At first glance, the town of Kuberpidi looks like a junkyard. There are mounds of pale dirt, rusted machinery, and drilling rigs scattered across the desert. There are very few buildings. But then you notice the chimneys sticking out of the ground. Kuberpidi is a town of 2,500 people, and half of them live underground. They don't live in bunkers or basements. They live in dugouts, beautiful, spacious homes carved directly into the sandstone hills. White man in a hole. The town was born in 1915. A 14-year-old boy named Willie Hutchison was part of a gold prospecting party. He wandered off to look for water. He didn't find water, but he found something else lying on the surface of the dirt, a gemstone that flashed with the colors of the rainbow. He had found opal. It turned out to be the largest opal field in the world. Miners rushed to the desert. But they quickly realized that living in a tin shack in 120-degree heat was suicide. The soldiers returning from the trenches of World War I brought a solution. They were used to digging in. They realized the sandstone here was perfect, stable enough to hold a roof, but soft enough to pickaxe. They discovered that just 4 meters below the surface, the temperature remains a constant, pleasant 23 degrees Celsius 73 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of whether it is scorching summer or freezing winter outside. The local Aboriginal people watched these crazy Europeans digging into the ground like rabbits, and gave the place its name, Kuberpidi, which translates roughly to white man in a hole. The architecture of sandstone. Walking into a dugout is a sensory shock. You step out of the blinding, silent heat into a cool, echoing twilight. Modern dugouts are not caves. They are luxury homes. They have full kitchens, Wi-Fi, and tiled bathrooms. The walls are not concrete. They are the natural rock, often sealed with a clear gloss to prevent dust. The sandstone displays beautiful bands of red, white, and ochre. The architecture follows the geology. There are no windows, except near the entrance, so lighting is crucial. Ventilation shafts rise vertically through the rock to the surface, sucking out stale air. The best part about living in a dugout? If you need another room, a nursery for a new baby or a guest room, you don't call a contractor. You just rent a tunneling machine and carve it out yourself. And sometimes, the renovation pays for itself. There are stories of locals digging a new pantry and hitting a vein of opal worth thousands of dollars in the wall. You aren't just renovating, you're prospecting. The subterranean society. The underground lifestyle has created one of the most eccentric communities on Earth. Kuberpidi is a frontier town. It attracts people who want to disappear or live by their own rules. There are over 45 nationalities living together in the dirt. The infrastructure is bizarrely complete. The churches, there are 3 underground churches. The Serbian Orthodox Church is the most spectacular, with a vaulted ceiling carved 17 meters deep and intricate stained glass windows that are backlit by artificial light. The bookstore, an underground bookshop where the dusty volumes are safe from the desert sun. The hotel, tourists can sleep in. The Desert Cave Hotel, experiencing the silence of the rock. There is no grass, so the local golf course is simply oil-soaked sand. Because it's too hot to play during the day, they play at night with glowing golf balls. The warning signs. But the ground is Swiss cheese. There are over 250,000 mine shafts in the area. Most are uncovered. If you walk backwards to take a photo, you might die. The town is littered with signs that read, "Danger, deep shafts. Do not run. Do not walk backwards." It is a reminder that the earth here is hollow. The town exists in a fragile equilibrium between the rock that protects them and the rock that wants to swallow them. The blueprint for Mars. Scientists and futurists are looking at Kuberpidi with renewed interest. It is not just a quirky tourist stop, it is a prototype. If humans are ever to colonize Mars or the Moon, we cannot live on the surface. The radiation and temperature fluctuations would kill us. We will have to live like the people of Kuberpidi, underground, in constant temperature lava tubes or carved habitats. Kuberpidi proves that humans don't just survive underground, they can create a culture, a community, and a home. Transition. The people of Kuberpidi go underground to escape the heat. But there are others who go deeper, much deeper, to escape something else, noise. Not sound, but cosmic noise. To study the smallest particles in the universe, neutrinos and dark matter, scientists need silence. They need to shield their detectors from the cosmic rays that constantly bombard the Earth's surface. We are leaving the sandstone of Australia and heading to a nickel mine in Canada, 2 kilometers down, where physicists are waiting for a ghost particle to hit a tank of heavy water. We are going to the deep Earth science. The deep Earth science, the quietest place in the universe. The cosmic noise. The surface of the Earth is noisy. We don't hear it with our ears, but to a physicist, the surface is a deafening cacophony. Every second, billions of cosmic rays, high-energy particles produced by exploding stars and black holes, slam into the atmosphere. They shower the ground with radiation. If you are trying to study the rarest, most delicate particles in the universe, like neutrinos or the theoretical dark matter, trying to detect them on the surface is like trying to hear a pin drop in the middle of a heavy metal concert. The signal is swamped by the cosmic static. To find silence, you have to go down. You have to use the Earth itself as a shield. The descent to Snow Lab. In Sudbury, Ontario, Canada, there's a nickel mine called the Creighton Mine. It is an industrial hellscape of crushed rock, heavy machinery, and grime. But if you get into the cage, the rattling elevator that drops miners into the abyss, and descend 2 kilometers, 6,800 feet, straight down, you arrive at something that looks like it belongs in Star Trek. This is Snow Lab. The journey is a study in contrasts. You travel through the hot, humid mine tunnels, dodging massive ore trucks, covered in the dust of the Canadian Shield. Then, you reach a heavy steel door. You take off your boots. You strip naked. You shower, scrubbing every inch of your body to remove the mine dust, which contains trace amounts of uranium and thorium, which are radioactive. You put on a lint-free blue clean suit, hairnet and goggles. You step through the airlock. Suddenly, the humidity vanishes. The air is crisp, cool, and filtered. The walls are not jagged rock, but white-painted concrete kept spotless by a team of cleaners who vacuum the floors and walls constantly. You are in a Class 2000 clean room, buried under enough rock to crush a mountain. The ghost traps. Snow Lab exists to catch neutrinos. Neutrinos are ghost particles. They are created by the nuclear fusion in the sun. They are so small and interact so weakly with matter that they can pass through a light year of lead without hitting anything. Right now, trillions of them are passing through your body. You don't feel them. But occasionally, very occasionally, a neutrino hits an atom head-on. When it does, it produces a tiny flash of light, Cherenkov radiation. To see that flash, you need total darkness. The SNO experiment, Sudbury Neutrino Observatory, was a massive acrylic sphere, 12 meters across, filled with 1,000 tons of heavy water, $300 million worth. It was surrounded by 9,600 photomultiplier tubes, electronic eyes waiting for a spark. Because they were 2 kilometers deep, the cosmic rays couldn't reach them. The rock absorbed the noise. The only thing that could penetrate that deep were the neutrinos. It worked. In 2015, the Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded to Arthur B. McDonald for the work done here proving that neutrinos have mass. They solved the mystery of the sun by burying themselves in the dark. The dark matter hunt. Now, the lab is hunting something even more elusive, dark matter. We know that 85% of the gravity in the universe comes from matter we cannot see. It holds galaxies together. If it weren't there, the Milky Way would spin itself apart. But we have never touched it. We have never seen it. Deep in Snow Lab, there are vats of liquid argon and supercooled germanium crystals sitting in absolute silence, waiting for a dark matter particle, a WIMP, weakly interacting massive particle, to bump into them. It is a vigil. The scientists are like monks in a subterranean monastery, meditating on the nature of reality, waiting for the universe to speak. The life that shouldn't exist. While the physicists look up at the universe through the rock, biologists are looking at the rock itself. And they are finding monsters. For a long time, we thought life required the sun. Photosynthesis was the base of the food chain. No sun meant no life. We were wrong. Deep in the gold mines of South Africa, Poning Mine, 2.8 kilometers down, scientists found a nematode, a microscopic worm, swimming in the fracture water of the rock. They named it Halocephalobus mephisto, the devil worm. It doesn't need the sun. It feeds on bacteria that form biofilms on the rock. And what do the bacteria eat? They eat radiation. They found a bacterium called Desulfuridus audaxviator. The bold traveler. It lives in total isolation. It gets its energy from the radioactive decay of uranium in the surrounding rock, which splits water molecules into hydrogen, which it eats. It is an ecosystem of one. It is an alien on Earth. The deep biosphere. This discovery changed everything. We now estimate that the deep biosphere, the mass of microbes living miles beneath the seafloor and the continents, might outweigh all life on the surface combined. There is more life in the Earth than on it. These creatures live in extreme heat, crushing pressure, and total darkness. They reproduce once every 1,000 years. They are practically immortal zombies. This gives us hope for space. If life can thrive inside the solid rock of Earth, fueled by radioactivity rather than sunlight, then life could exist inside the crust of Mars, or in the subsurface oceans of Europa, Jupiter's moon. Transition. The deep Earth has taught us that the underground is a habitat. It shields from radiation, useful for humans, and provides chemical energy, useful for microbes. So, if we are going to become a multiplanetary species, we won't be building glass domes on the surface of Mars like in the 1950s comic books. Those would be shredded by sandstorms and fried by cosmic rays. We will do what the devil worm did. We will do what the residents of Kubapiti did. We will go into the tubes. We are going to Chapter 24, Mars Habitats. Mars Habitats, the new caveman. The surface trap. For decades, science fiction illustrators have sold us a lie. They show us glass domes on the red sands of Mars, with astronauts looking out at the rusty horizon, bathing in the sunlight. If we build that, we die. Mars is a death trap. Without a magnetic field to deflect solar winds and with an atmosphere 100 times thinner than Earth's, the surface is bombarded by galactic cosmic rays. A human standing on the surface would receive a lethal dose of radiation over time, drastically increasing cancer rates and frying the central nervous system. Then there is the temperature. It swings from a pleasant 20 degrees Celsius 68 degrees Fahrenheit at the equator during the day to a bone-shattering minus 73 degrees Celsius minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit at night. The thermal stress on building materials, expanding and contracting every single day, would crack almost any structure we could transport from Earth. And finally, the dust. The Martian regolith is razor-sharp, because there is no water erosion to smooth it, and contains perchlorates, toxic chemicals. Global dust storms can envelop the planet for months, blocking the solar panels we rely on for power. To survive on Mars, we cannot live on Mars. We must live in it. The giant's veins. Fortunately, Mars has already built the housing for us. Mars was once a violently volcanic world. Massive volcanoes like Olympus Mons, the size of France, spewed rivers of lava for millions of years. As the top layer of these lava rivers cooled and hardened into a crust, the molten rock underneath kept flowing, eventually draining away. What remained were hollow tunnels, lava tubes. We have them on Earth, in Hawaii, Iceland, and the Canary Islands. But on Earth, gravity pulls them down, so they are usually only a few meters wide. On Mars, where gravity is 38% of Earth's, the physics changes. The roofs can support immense weight without collapsing. In 2011, NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter spotted something strange on the slopes of Pavonis Mons. It wasn't a crater. It was a hole. A skylight. It was perfectly round, about 35 meters across, dropping straight down into a black void. Scientists realized they were looking at the entrance to a subterranean cathedral. Estimates suggest that Martian lava tubes could be 100 to 250 meters wide. That is wide enough to fly a Boeing 747 inside without the wingtips touching the walls. Some might be large enough to house the entire skyline of Manhattan. The inflatable city. The colonization plan, now favored by many at NASA and private space companies, is the third age of caves. Phase 1. Robots land near a skylight. They rappel down into the darkness. They map the tube using LiDAR, checking for stability. Phase 2. We don't send concrete or steel, too heavy. We send inflatables. Massive Kevlar or Vectron balloons are lowered into the tube and inflated. Phase 3. The astronauts arrive. They live inside the balloons. Living inside a lava tube solves every problem instantly. Radiation. The 50 meters of rock roof blocks 100% of cosmic rays. Temperature. Just like the beer caves of St. Louis or the dugouts of Cuber, the temperature inside the tube is constant. It is cold, about -20 degrees Celsius, but it is stable. It is much easier to heat a constant -20 degrees Celsius room than a dome that swings by 100 degrees every day. Micrometeoroids. The rock acts as a shield against the tiny space rocks that constantly pelt the surface. Biophilia in the dark. The challenge will not be engineering, it will be psychology. We are creatures of the sun. Living in a tube for years could break the human mind. The Mars underground will need to be designed with biophilia, our innate connection to nature. Architects envision using artificial sunlight, full-spectrum LEDs, to create a day and night cycle inside the tube. We will grow vertical gardens on the walls of the inflatables. The smell of green plants, the humidity of transpiration, and the sound of trickling water will be essential for mental health. We will create a green Earth bubble inside the red Mars rock. The search for neighbors. There is a final, thrilling possibility. If the surface is too harsh for life now, and if the water on Mars evaporated or froze billions of years ago, where did the life go? If we are planning to hide in the lava tubes to survive, maybe the Martians did the same thing 3 billion years ago. The lava tubes might contain ice. They might contain evidence of ancient microbial life that retreated underground as the atmosphere thinned. Or, like the devil worm, in the South African mines, there might be life there now, living in the damp, dark rock, shielded from the radiation. We might rappel down into a tube to build a house, only to find that the basement is already occupied. Transition. Our journey is almost complete. We have gone from the primitive caves of Turkey to the high-tech caves of Mars. We have seen that the history of humanity is a cycle. We started in the rock, and to save our future, we are returning to it. It is time for the final reflection. Why does the underground call to us? Why do we fear it, yet constantly retreat to it? We are going to the epilogue. Epilogue, why we will always return to the Earth. The iceberg effect. As we stand at the end of this journey, looking back through the ventilation shafts of Derinquiu, the ossuaires of Paris, and the lava tubes of Mars, a pattern emerges. Humanity is becoming an iceberg species. For most of history, our presence was defined by what was visible above the waterline, our huts, our castles, our skyscrapers. But as the 21st century matures, the mass of our civilization is shifting downward. In London, in the wealthy boroughs of Kensington and Chelsea, a strange phenomenon has taken hold. Because planning laws forbid building higher, to protect the historic skyline, billionaires are digging down. They are building mega basements, 3, 4, sometimes 5 stories deep beneath their Victorian townhouses. These are not cellars. They contain swimming pools, cinemas, car museums, and servant quarters. The house you see on the street is merely the tip of the iceberg. The real life happens in the artificial light below. In Mexico City, architects have proposed the Earth Scraper, a 65-story inverted pyramid built into the center of the Zocalo, the main square. Instead of a tower blocking the sky, it would be a glass-bottomed hole, allowing the sun to filter down to offices and homes hundreds of meters deep. We are running out of up. We are running out of out. The only direction left is down. The womb and the tomb. Why does the underground fascinate us so much? Why did you read 100,000 words about holes in the ground? It is because the underground is the ultimate duality of the human condition. It is the womb, and it is the tomb. Psychologically, going underground triggers two primal, conflicting instincts. Fear, it is the place of darkness, of crushing weight, of being trapped. It is the grave. It is where we put the things we are afraid of, the dead bodies, Paris, the sewage, London, the nuclear waste, Finland's Onkalo repository. Safety, it is the place of the mother. It is the burrow. It is stable, warm, and hidden from the predators and storms of the surface. It is where we go when the world ends, Derinkuyu, the seed vault. We spend our lives suspended between these two poles. We fight to stay on the surface, in the light, but when the sirens wail, our instinct drives us back to the earth. The low line. There is a glimpse of a middle path, a future where the underground is not a place of darkness, but a continuation of the light. In New York City, beneath the Lower East Side, lies the abandoned Williamsburg Bridge Trolley Terminal. It is a dank, cobblestone ruin from 1903. But a project known as the Lowline proposes to turn it into the world's first underground park. Using remote skylight technology, sunlight is collected on the street above by parabolic dishes, channeled through fiber optic cables, and beamed into the ceiling of the underground terminal. The light is strong enough to allow photosynthesis. Trees, grass, and flowers can grow in a space that hasn't seen the sun in 70 years. If this succeeds, it changes everything. It means the underground is no longer dead space. It means we can bring the biosphere with us. We can knit the surface and the subsurface together into a single, three-dimensional organism. The final ascent. We began this story with a man swinging a sledgehammer in a Turkish basement, opening a hole into the past. We end it with an astronaut rappelling into a Martian volcano, opening a hole into the future. The ground beneath your feet is not solid. It is a library. It is a machine. It is a shield. It is a trap. And it is a home. Next time you walk down a city street, stop for a moment. Ignore the skyscrapers reaching for the clouds. Look down at the pavement. Listen to the hum of the subway, the rush of the water in the pipes, the silent fiber optic pulses of the internet, and the deep, geological groan of the tectonic plates. There is a whole world down there, waiting for you. We have explored the dark. Now, it is time to climb the ladder, push open the hatch, and step back into the blinding, beautiful sun. The end.